closed session this evening, and we are now back downstairs. And so we will move on to the first couple items in the meeting. The first thing is there are no additional agenda items to this evening's meeting. The upcoming meetings, a reminder that Monday, February 17th, city offices are closed for the President's Day holiday, so the council meeting will be on Tuesday, February 18th. And then the next night, Wednesday, February 19th, we will be having roundtables with the city departments and the council at 7 p.m. here in the auditorium. And again, on Thursday, February 27th, which is the following week, we will be doing the same thing. And that will be some preliminary discussions before we get into the budget, give the council and the departments a chance to talk about how things are going and where they are. So that's a little update on upcoming agenda items. We'll now go to public comment. Since we don't have any voting items this evening, this would just be any general comments about anything on our work session agenda or anything not on the agenda at all. And welcome back to former council member Colleen Clay. It's good to see you back in the room.
Oh, thank you. I'm happy to come and visit everybody. So my name is Colleen Clay, and I live at 800 Hayward Avenue in Takoma Park, Maryland. I came to talk to you today about funding for the Folk Festival. I am no longer the chair of the Folk Festival. I have stayed on to do their volunteer management, but I no longer chair the Folk Festival. I came to talk to you about funding the festival as an individual line item in the budget, as has been done in previous times. I understand that the 4th of July parade is being funded as a line item, and I would like to see the festival funded that way as well. As you know, the festival has been around for several decades with Takoma Park, and we have a small budget, and the city has been a big part of that budget in recent years. I think about the same time that the 4th of July parade came to the city for extra money when the economy was in bad shape. So did the Folk Festival, and I think it's a good exchange for the city. You may be aware that most of the money that we get from our budget actually goes right back into the city of Takoma Park. The Takoma Park Middle School gets the funds from renting the school, and they use that money, and that's one of their big events. They get a fair amount of money from the festival, and they rely on that funding, and we provide additional funding to them as well. And that's a good $4,000, sometimes $5,000, depending on what we rent. We have about the same amount of money, $5,000 to $6,000, that we return to the community for our beneficiary groups who engage in volunteering at the festival. Most of our sound folks we're paying are here in the Takoma Park area and around. So we spend most of the money and put it right back into the festival. And recently we've had an ATM machine at the festival. And surprisingly to me, we get $30,000 of withdrawals out of the ATM machine. They come back and reload it. And that money is also being spent, it does not get spent at the festival, but a lot of it gets spent with people who come to Takoma Park for the day and then spend money. So I'm asking that you move the festival over into the line item budget and take it out of the large grants process so that we can have some certainty for the long-term funding for the festival. It really helps with our planning and decision making. We're making decisions now about go or no go with the festival based on the surety of funding that we have, and it also makes a difference how we scale the festival based on how much funding we think we're going to have. So having that kind of stability, which I think is very important to the 4th of July parade, is also really important to the Folk Festival. So I want to thank you for your time, and if you have any questions, let me know.
What level of funding do you expect, noting that you're no longer the chair, the TPFF would request for FY15?
I think the same as we had last year, which was $10,000. And we no longer get funding from the Arts and Humanities Commission because our budget is small because we're such a community-based organization and we do everything through volunteering, while other groups' budgets have grown because they use their money to pay somebody to run their festival or to do their advertising. We try to do as little of that as possible. So now $50,000 is the threshold for the mid-level grants. So the $5,000 that we used to get from the county, we don't get that funding any longer, because we've stayed small and very Takoma Park centric. So it's a trade-off.
So if the council was going to allocate $10,000 from this upcoming fiscal year into the future, and we gave like a 3% increase on top of that, would that be sufficient to maintain some type of financial money from the city?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Thanks very much.
Sure, thank you. Have a great night.
You're not going to stick around for the discussion?
Are you going to discuss it? I didn't realize you were actually going to discuss it tonight.
It's on the agenda tonight.
Oh, well, I was sitting. And this chair broke. Number 10.
Okay.
Till
Other
9
public
o'clock.
comments?
What was you going to tell her?
You got to stick around a while.
Not till 9 o'clock.
My name is Lorraine Pearsall. I'm with Historic Tacoma, and I just want to talk to you a little bit about general concerns with zoning, and I know that Rose is here, and I look forward to hearing her talk tonight. And this is probably one of the most controversial things that Montgomery County has done. I think Rose would agree with that. There's just been a lot of changes and hard to keep up with, a lot of opposition, very controversial. One of the major things that still bothers me is that we seem to be pushing for a district versus a sectional map amendment, which means we're doing a broad one-size-fits-all kind of thing, and outside of a master plan. And that worries me. When I was here in '92, we did a master plan for Tacoma Park. It was deliberative. There was a group of people. The zoning follows the master plan. It's not the other way around. I'm concerned that in our low-scale historic district, we are using a CRT zone, which is kind of the medium, which is encourages development and instead of CRN, and the neighborhood zone is a gentler zone. There are fewer loopholes to make it bigger, and Rose can speak to this, but I can just call it in these inelegant terms. But there are ways to come around the zoning if you do certain things, and I would like to hear Rose's thoughts about that. But for example, Historic Tacoma's building is right across the street from residences, and yet our zoning is a CRT zone, and I'm very uncomfortable with that, and I would like to see things like that changed, and I think it would be safer to have a CRN zone in the historic district. And I'd like you to bring in some other people to talk about this. When I read here, the goal, the reason why we're doing to encourage better development, enhance compatibility, and promote sustainability, I would disagree. It's really increasing density. And I would urge that you bring in Meredith Wellington, Mark Elrich, Lydia Sullivan, and some other people to talk with you. And I think the city should discourage zoning changes outside of a master plan to begin with. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Mr. Lovelace.
Hello, I'm Pat Lovelace, your official peace delegate, 7620 Maple Avenue, Tacoma Park, Maryland. I want to let you people know out there that June 24th is the primary election day. June 12th through the 19th is when we're having the early elections. So really, everybody out there, plan to go out and vote. It's only 141 days ahead now. It may sound like a lot, but before you know it, it'll be the 4th of July and the voting will be all over. Time goes by fast. So please, everybody, you got a lot of time to get your friends out to register to vote. And think about bringing your friends and your neighbors down to the polls to vote if they haven't got a way down there. Think about what you can do for your city. That's one of the things you can do. Don't forget it, June 24th is the election day for the primary elections. June 12th through the 19th is the early elections. And you got to remember the problems we're having with Congress now and the problems we're having with the Senate, getting things passed, getting the unemployment checks passed, the food stamps saved, all this stuff could have been prevented if we had some people out there who registered to vote and who bothered to go out and vote responsibly. That's what this problem is if we don't have that. Also, I want to say I miss you, Kay Daniels Cohen. I miss you. I wish you could come to the meetings again. I kind of miss your wonderful, cheerful voice. And I'm going to give you a gold star anyway because I love you. Or should I say, I'll give you the gold peace sign. Yep. And I'd like to tell everybody out there, think about what you can do for your city. Also, on Saturday, February 8th, we're having a demonstration in North Carolina for civil rights and also for the right to vote. What the governor down there has done to their right to vote could happen to us if we don't do anything about it. We should start doing it now. Stamp out voter discrimination laws and stamp out the obstructionism we have in our Congress and Senate now. That can be done through voting and also through active participation. So come on down. I'm hoping to get down there. If I got to ride down, I'm going down. I don't care what the weather is. If I got to way down there, I'm going down there. I'm not worried about anything. So if you want to help me out, come on down. And also register to vote. And also vote, vote, vote. That's the main thing I can say about the primaries. They're one of the most important elections you can ever have. Thank you very much for letting me tell you. And I hope you listen. Please help me out with this.
Thank you. Anybody else wish to make any comments? Seeing none, we'll move along to council comments. I'll start out with one comment. I was talking with Councilmember Daniels Cohen today. She's not going to be here and she's not participating remotely, but she did say that if she were here, she would want to give the council gold stars for all the support that we've given her in her difficulties. And she wishes she could be here and hopes to return next week, and just wanted to express her thanks to the council and to so many other people in the city who have been so kind to her. For myself, I'll just note a couple things. I went to Annapolis a couple times last week, and one day I went to the Ways and Means Committee and briefed them on the Maryland Municipal League priorities, which are highway user revenues and tax duplication. Just a reminder that the highway user revenues are in the proposed budget at a slightly higher level than last year, and tax duplication is a strategic initiative of Maryland Municipal League, and trying to work with the Maryland Association of Counties to come up with some things that will fix tax duplication. I'm not holding my breath, but it is a priority, and I did brief the Ways and Means Committee on that. Also wanted to let people know that the city manager and I had a meeting with Peter Francho last week, talking about what we can do to encourage more coordination and communication about cross-border issues on crime, and we're continuing to see what we might be able to present on that, and we'll let people know once we've got that a little farther along. I will be at the Maryland Mayors Association Conference this week in Annapolis, so I'll be spending a couple days there, and I'll take the opportunity to meet with mayors from across the state and also with legislators while I'm there. Want to remind folks that February 9th, which is this Saturday, is the fourth annual Midwinter Play Day in Tacoma. Sorry, it's Sunday, February 9th. And it's from 2 to 4, and it's in this building. So it's indoors. And that's in anticipation of having a little cooler weather than we've had the last couple of days. And also, one final note, there were a number of people in the WACO area, which is Westmoreland Area Community Organization, particularly along Westmoreland Avenue, who found that their composting bins went missing today. And it was basically many people on the same street, and somebody saw a woman in a white van picking up their composting bins and hauling them off at about 1:30 this afternoon. So just to let people know, somebody is snatching compost bins off the street.
Before they're picked up by Public Works?
Probably after.
Curious.
Probably after.
If I could just note, I noticed last week along Carroll Avenue that it looked like many of the buckets were missing, and in some cases just the lids were left.
Not quite sure why somebody wants those, but
Has the police taken a report?
I believe so.
They have, I'm not sure it's been reported.
I had that impression that it was being coordinated with somebody at the city, but I'm not sure. But somebody did observe a woman in a white van at 1:30 this afternoon taking them. And that's all I've got. Councilmember Grimes.
Thank you. Not 140 days off, so I hope I'm not too late. On March the 2nd, Sunday, the Tacoma Park Presbyterian Church will host a meeting of the Community Kitchen Initiative. That is going to be to report on progress with the kitchen design, the business plan, and so on, and to consult with community members to accept their views and discuss them about the operational planning for the kitchen. So that will be Sunday, March the 2nd from 2 to 4 p.m. at the Tacoma Park Presbyterian Church in the assembly room. You enter that from the playground area off Tulip Avenue. You go in the gate and make a left underneath the sanctuary. That's it.
Councilmember Schultz.
I had the occasion this past week to attend at the Council of Governments I guess it's probably what you'd call a quarterly meeting of the Climate, Energy, and Environment Planning Committee, and it's my assignment. That's my job on the City Council, is to be the city's representative at that on that committee. And at this session, there was a panel that took up most of the 2-hour meeting on the subject of net zero use of energy. There was a representative of the U.S. Army there talking about what the Army is doing in that regard. They don't use energy sustainability because that term means different things in the military than it does in the civilian world. So they use the term net zero, and basically what the U.S. Army is, what she was describing, was a very elaborate plan for the Army basically producing as much energy as it uses, which means a net zero use of energy. The Army manages what she said was over 1 billion square feet of space in all of its facilities in the United States and elsewhere. There was another speaker, and I'll be very brief about this, who was talking about the architectural design, engineering of structures, whether individual townhouses or freestanding buildings that are used for various kinds of purposes, that the technology exists in regard to some that buildings can be literally taken off the grid, that using battery power and recycling of water and other means of conservation, that they can literally survive without being connected to gas, water, or electrical utilities, and showed a number of buildings in the United States that have been built, some here in Maryland, to do that. I think that it was something that was not saying that this is the way it should be in the future. It's just that these are models of showing where the technology stands, so that we can look forward to a time when there'll be redundancy of energy sources and redundancy of water sources, so that when the power goes out or some natural disaster occurs, we're not left in total distress and a sense of abandonment. Absolutely fascinating to listen to the research that is going on in this area, because it just gives you an idea of what is possible, what can be accomplished. And I just wanted to share that. That's really all I wanted to speak about tonight. Thank you.
Any other colleagues have any comments? Councilmember Smith.
Thank you. Over the weekend, I had the opportunity to attend the Montgomery County Human Rights Commission forum on Trayvon Martin at the County Executive Building. It was very well done. It was attended by the county's police chief, Chief Manger, and the county executive dropped by. And the basic premise was, can a Trayvon Martin incident happen in Montgomery County? And everybody, including the police chief, agreed that it could. But it was a very good forum. I would like to ask the city manager about if we could have a CO2 refuel station at the Public Works Department, if that's possible. Maybe Daryl can look into whether or not it's feasible. Thank you.
Anybody else? Seeing none, we'll move along to city manager's comments.
Thank you. Really, just one comment, just to see if the council received this. We very late on Friday we received a letter from council members Navarro and Reamer regarding municipal tax duplication. I wasn't exactly sure who got that email.
Didn't see it.
Okay, so I will forward this on. It really partially responds, I guess, to the MML letter that was sent requesting sort of next steps from the GO committee meeting, which we went to in October of last year.
Yes.
If I'm getting it right. The message effectively says that they received our letter. Their response is that they would like to convene the working group, which was one of the outcomes or next steps from the October meeting. Starting in June, they have a recommended structure in terms of who would participate in the working group, and that working group would convene its work in October of this year. So obviously, trying to make sure that there is a structure in place, at least as they see it, or something that they can discuss for the fiscal year 16 budget as opposed to the fiscal year 15 budget in terms of a next step. They've got a couple of other suggestions in here just in terms of what they might propose as potential talking points for that committee to think about. But I just wanted to make sure that people were aware that we did get a letter, and we're currently we'll be formulating sort of what we think is a response if we think that there's anything else that we'd like to discuss. But I'll send that email on to you all so you can see it as well. Thank you.
And the response might be, gee, you're dragging this out even longer.
Just to follow up on that, and no explanation for why wait so long. I mean, that's the thing that sort of stands out from that is, even if it's convening a task force is one thing, but then not doing so for 6 or 8 more months is sort of strange.
There's a sentence in here that says the working group should convene in June after the council's completed its budget process and is ready to report back to the GO committee in October 2014. So presumably, from their perspective, it may have something to do with their budget.
I have to say, this was indicated to me by former Council Chair Navarro when she was Council Chair that she didn't expect anything to happen before the FY15 budget had been concluded. In other words, until the time frame that we're talking about. That was months ago. So I would be surprised if I'm the only one who had heard that from them.
Not necessarily that they wouldn't even get going on it till June. I think the thought had been when we were there in October that the task force a small task force could get through things in fairly short order, and could be presenting things back to them after they've done their budget in June, rather than waiting until the budget is completely over to start. I
Right,
think
that
that was the sense that
Right.
people were talking.
Same sense, right.
And I had the same indication as is in that letter from Council President Rice. Anything else that you have? Okay. We have one set of minutes from January 27th. Does somebody want to move adoption of those minutes?
Move them.
Moved by Councilmember Mayle, seconded by Councilmember Grimes. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That carries unanimously. And we will now move to our presentation this evening. And I see that Rose Krasnow is here. She's the Deputy Director of the Montgomery County Planning Department, and she was formerly the mayor of Rockville, and did an outstanding job as mayor of Rockville, and I know she's doing an outstanding job at Park and Planning as well. And are you still going to have Pamela Dunn, project manager, here with you, or are you going to go alone?
I'm going to, is this on? Yes.
Yes.
I'm going to go alone. Miss Dunn had a death in the family, so she has not been in.
Sorry to hear that.
Which means I may not be able to answer every question, but I'll do my best.
Okay, and one thing you might want to know is that that podium can go up and down, and there's a button there at the near left corner, so that if it would be comfortable a little lower, you can do that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor Williams. I always used to speak right after Doug Duncan, and I always had that problem with the microphone. He would raise it way up, and I would have to bring it way down. But it's my pleasure to be here tonight, and before I start on my presentation, I just wanted to mention to Councilmember Schultz that, probably several months ago now, we actually approved a site plan for United Therapeutics, which of course has a large presence in downtown Silver Spring. We approved a site plan for a net zero building that will be at the corner of Colesville and Spring. Mm-hmm. It's really quite something. I encourage you to go on our website and look up the plans for it, because it will really be a gateway type of building as you come into downtown Silver Spring, and to my knowledge will be the first net zero building that we have.
Wow.
And will they maintain the parking garage?
That parking garage is exactly where that building will be.
Right.
The county actually sold that parking garage to United Therapeutics. But on to the topic at hand. As you all know, we have been working on this zoning ordinance rewrite for several years. In fact, for those of you who watch some of the Fed work sessions, Jeff Zients would always start each one with some major event in U.S. history, and he always said, and the zoning code rewrite has taken longer than that. We basically started back in 2009, although I would say we started back in 2008, when staff came together and started analyzing our current code, which I believe most of you know is well over 1,200 pages long. I did not bring it tonight because, to be very honest, it's simply too heavy, but it makes a very good presentation item when you heft it up and people realize just how large and unwieldy it is, both in terms of size and, I would add, in terms of content. So in January of 2009, we issued a small document called our Zoning Discovery, and what it did was it looked at the code that exists today, looked at some of the problems that were involved, and tried to set the framework for how we would move forward. Not long thereafter, we appointed a zoning advisory panel composed of developers, composed of citizens, people from our Historic Preservation Commission, people from our elderly. We really tried to get a mix of people on our zoning advisory panel, and their role was not to vote on specific items, but really just to lend their opinions as we moved this along. And in January 2010, we came out with our annotated outline and our approach, and then we proceeded to start writing the actual code. And the plan, we've had numerous outreach meetings with the public, and of course the planning board, which started their review in September of 2012, had many public hearings and work sessions, and they released their draft in May of 2013. And then it went on to Fed, and Fed started their hearings and their review in the fall, over the summer. We had every Friday morning over the summer we were meeting with Fed, and the Fed draft was released in 2013. And just a few weeks ago, the entire council had a straw vote on the text portion only, and I'll elaborate on that further, of the code, and voted to approve it by a 7-1 vote. Now, that was only a straw vote, but just keep that in mind as I go through this presentation. So, as you all know, there were many reasons why we undertook this rewrite. Our county continues to grow. We're estimating another 200,000 people, certainly by 2050, if not before. Our county becomes more diverse in many, many ways, both in terms of the type of businesses we attract, the many people we have here. And then we're largely built out. While there is some land, fortunately we've preserved a lot of our land in the Ag Reserve, which is off limits. And we have at times said that less than 4% of our county is eligible to be developed. So what we're really looking at in the years ahead is redevelopment. And so the question is, how do you make that happen? Because our current code is unwieldy, outdated, and extremely complicated. I came to the Planning Commission in 2004 as the head of Development Review. I can't tell you how many meetings I had with different people who simply couldn't make heads or tails of what they were trying to read in the code. We didn't feel this was a very good way to move our county forward. So our revised code, we're hoping that it will be easier to use and more forward-thinking. We do think that it will encourage better development, enhance compatibility, and promote sustainability, ideas that really were not in place in terms of sustainability back in the 70s. And we feel that the new code is very supportive of our master plans. When we tried to do this, we knew that we had to balance, as you always have to do, different objectives. We did want to make the code more flexible. We knew that we really needed to improve our development review process to make it more efficient and timely. And as I said, we wanted to bring in more modern planning concepts. At the same time, you can't work in this county and not know that our neighborhoods are the best part of life here, that our residents wanted to be sure that the impacts on them would be minimized, that they would continue to have every opportunity possible to participate in the development process, and that we weren't looking to in any way change wholesale the stability that they've enjoyed as they live in Montgomery County. So our efforts were to modernize, clarify, and simplify, and I'm going to go through each of those a little more thoroughly. In terms of modernization, while you hear many people worry that this code will dramatically change the densities and make life very different here, I actually feel that this code is more restrictive in many ways than the current code is. For example, right now when we do a site plan, there is no requirement that we find conformity with our master plans. But in the new code, every site plan will require master plan conformity. We have also put in some new compatibility standards, particularly for those areas where our non-residential uses abut our residential neighborhoods. And we're requiring site plans for a lot more developments. Right now, only certain zones require site plans at all. In the new plan, anything 10,000 feet or larger will require a site plan.
Would you explain exactly what you mean by site plan?
Yes, I'll be happy to. And if anyone wants to interrupt as I speak, please do so. We have generally two plan types, and sometimes 3 plan types in our development process. So we require a preliminary plan, which looks at adequate public facilities and the platting of land. We're trying to determine if the schools are adequate, if the roads and the circulation is adequate. And then we go on in those zones that require it. And a preliminary plan sets your maximum development limit. So it'll tell you that you can develop 200,000 square feet, of which 100,000 of it will be commercial, and so it divides up the actual limits that you can reach. In those zones that require a site plan, though, we go on, and this is a much more detailed plan where we're actually looking at the buildings as they'll appear on site, making sure that we have some benefits that we're gaining from allowing additional density. And these were primarily in the current system. As I said, site plans weren't required everywhere. And if someone was developing under what we call standard method, which was fairly low density, they did not need to do site plan. But when they went to optional, then we usually did require a site plan, but only for the larger projects. So again, we are lowering the threshold for when a site plan is required. We're adding conformity with our master plans. And as I'll show later on, we've added these compatibility standards to make sure that the impact of something across the street from a residential neighborhood will not be too great.
Do you anticipate the change in the amount of time it takes to approve a site plan?
Well, no, I don't really. I mean, we have tried to incorporate some, how shall I say it, some changes in our review process. But one thing I have learned from my years is that we have so many aims, things we're trying to achieve, whether it be sustainability, forest conservation, traffic improvement. As we actually go through the site plan review process, working with the other agencies, Department of Transportation, Department of Environmental Protection, the utilities, we often find that it takes a fairly good amount of time to get through the site plan process. And I don't see this changing that at all. Particularly, as I said, we do always welcome citizen participation, and they have strong feelings as well. None of that's going to change under this process. We had talked about trying to eliminate one plan type. We did not do that here. So it should be a similar, very much allowing citizen participation type process.
Is citizen participation a requirement, or is it optional?
I would say it's a requirement in that one of the things we started doing in about 2006 is that we required every applicant, regardless whether it's a preliminary plan or a site plan, or even if they have to do both, to have what we call a pre-submission meeting. So before the plan ever comes into the planning department, they have to set up a meeting, invite us, both the property owners that will be affected and the civic associations and neighborhood associations, invite them. They're required to show us the notice of the meeting. They're required to take minutes and provide those to us. So that's, I would say, a required form of citizen participation. But we've never had trouble getting additional citizen participation. In fact, staff will meet with the public whenever they come in if they want to discuss a specific project. Obviously, as the plans go to the board, we always allow time both for correspondence to come in and be discussed in the staff report, also for the public to speak at a hearing in front of the planning board.
But a developer doesn't have to take into consideration any comments or anything that's given to them by residents.
Legally, I would agree with you. Legally, they are not required to. Staff, though, works very hard to make sure that if the concerns that are raised are valid concerns, that we ask the developer to change something in order to address those concerns.
Okay, so you take that role to make
Yes, we do.
Okay.
Yes, we do. So again, as we're modernizing, one of the things we've tried to do with varying success as this plan has continued to work its way from the planning board to the Fed to council is to bring in some of the new concepts that we all know are becoming very much a part of our life. things like urban agriculture. We've had many a discussion on goats and chickens as we've moved this through. My favorite was someone who talked about the fact that he had 4 chickens, and I can't remember, he had named them all. The one that really stuck with me was the chicken named Beyonce. But obviously we're looking at more solar collection systems, solar panels, how do we incorporate these, and uses based on intensity. But I think one of the primary reasons for doing the zoning code is since our last one was done in the 70s, we were still at a time when we really saw single-use zoning, where really the idea was you had your residential areas completely separate from any of your non-residential uses. So your commercial areas, if you wanted to go to a grocery store, you were going to need to get into a car and drive there. Walking was not encouraged in the old code at all, and certainly transit was also, I would call it a secondary thought. In terms of sustainability, the new code has worked hard on parking requirements. Probably didn't go as far as we thought we would originally when we started this. But nevertheless, we really are hoping that this code will lead to a lot of redevelopment of very large, often half-vacant surface parking lots. We encourage structured parking here, and we encourage shared parking. We also look at greening our surface parking areas a great deal, putting in more requirements for the type of shade trees, walking paths, et cetera, that you would need in a surface parking lot, and in general trying to promote pedestrian-focused design.
Can you just say a quick word about any changes that are proposed in the distances from transit, the way you draw the radius around transit, for how that affects the need for parking?
We haven't per se done anything with that in this, no.
Okay, so that remains?
Yes, it does.
Okay, thanks.
And although it's been a rather controversial subject, we have put in new floating zones. We actually think the floating zones help us achieve those objectives I mentioned earlier of allowing us some more flexibility, but at the same time putting in some real development parameters. I'll deal a little more with the floating zones as I go forward. So our new zoning code currently looks like this. Easy to lift. And it has pictures and graphics. And it's done in InDesign, which is a publishing type program that is much more user-friendly, I guess you might say. And there are many things we tried to do to help clarify the code. So as I said, we use some graphics and diagrams in it. One of the problems with our current code, and I can't stress this enough, it's very hard to tell which zones are Euclidean zones and which zones are floating zones. Even some of our staff has trouble figuring that out in the current code. The new code will clearly delineate by chapter Euclidean zones versus floating zones.
And can you explain Euclidean?
Well, Euclidean, of course, a famous zoning case that somewhat started zoning. Occurred in Ohio in the 1920s. The case was Euclid versus, I don't remember who it was versus. Thank you so much. And you would think a planner would know that, wouldn't you? But, and obviously that was the idea that you wanted to separate your uses more. And a floating zone basically, so you have a map that shows very defined Euclidean zones, and so in a certain Euclidean zone, it's very clearly spelled out what you can do and what you can't and where you can do these things. A floating zone literally floats above the county and can settle in a specific area, but only, particularly in the new code, only if you meet certain parameters. Not like I can put a large industrial use in the middle of a residential area. That is simply not allowed, not under the old code, not under the new code. We've worked on, as you know, when the CR zone was adopted, and it was adopted before this zoning code rewrite started, although it did create a lot of angst, I know, for several people. One of the things about the CR zones is that we put in a system of benefit points. We had, certainly when I was in Rockville and in the county as well, when we would allow a more dense building, basically what we got in return for that density was some sort of public plaza, sometimes public art, but nothing that people felt was quite enough in return for the density that was allowed. One of the ideas behind the CR zone were there were a lot of benefits that we knew the public wanted, and we felt that through the CR zone we had a better system for getting some of those things. But trying to figure out how many points to give for a specific benefit, we quickly learned when we started applying the CR zone was a little tricky. So when the first CR zone plans came into us, somebody said, okay, you told me I needed 100 points. Here's a system that I'm going to use to get 100 points. And we said, great. And then when we looked at it, we realized, well, they picked the cheapest 100 points or the ones that suited their purposes the most. But we wanted to have more control over the points that they were able to get. So we quickly got involved, and it once again became a negotiation of, no, you think you should get 25 points for that. We only think you should get 8. And we think you need to provide a few other things. So that was good, but we continue to refine that. And in this new code, we are working to further refine the point system. And of course, as any new code would require, we do have protections for legal non-conforming uses and all the existing approvals. And I can go into the grandfathering further in if people want me to. It gets a little complicated. And my favorite part of the new zoning code is it greatly simplifies the code. We currently have over 120 zones in our code. I'm not sure how this happened, but there seemed to be a feeling that every time we did a master plan, we couldn't use our existing zones. We had to come up with a new zone specifically for the area we were dealing with. Many of these new zones look just like other zones we already had, except that one little thing might be different. So we might require a different lot dimension, or we might say instead of 18,000 square feet as your minimum lot size, you needed 20,000 square feet. But generally, they were the same zones, just with different names. It's one reason people got so confused. With the new code, we consolidate those zones down to 39. And that enables us to have one use table. I don't know if you can really read it, but the use table appears here below. We're able to list all the zones across the top and all the uses down the side so that anyone can simply open up their zoning code, look at that use table, and figure out where their uses are allowed or aren't, whereas in the current you have to go through many sections of the code where we list all the uses each time and the many, many different zones. So certainly consolidating the zones, a huge step forward in my opinion, and consolidating the uses was another, because we had many uses that you've probably never heard of and certainly weren't in use in this county. We realized it was time to get rid of those. They were obsolete. And we had, again, not quite sure why, but we had many uses divided in unusual ways. So we had several different types of office. We had several different types of retail, and yet we never had like anything that said grocery store. Very odd. So we tried to add some real consistency to our use table. And like I said, we didn't really get rid of any plans, but we have given some, we think, easier to understand names. So instead of a project plan, because the CR zone employed a sketch plan, that's a plan before your preliminary site where you're really just getting into the details of what you want to do. Not always required, but required when you're in a CR zone area. So we're trying to make sure that our vocabulary is simplified. So we got rid of the idea of a project plan, a concept plan. You still have to do these plans, but it will now be called a sketch plan. And we did the same in some of our rezoning cases. We just made sure that everyone had to provide us with a development plan. We had many different names in the current code. No one was quite sure what the difference was between a schematic development plan and a regular development plan. Please don't ask me because I'm not sure I could tell you, but it won't be an issue in the new code. Our layout for each chapter will follow the same outline, And we've worked very hard, thanks in large part to Jeff Zients, to make sure that we're using plain English language, not legalese. So it's very important to remember that when we started this new code, what we realized we wanted to do is to promote mixed-use development, but not in our residential areas. So there's almost no changes at all proposed in this code for any of our residential areas. Our what we call some of our rural zones, we are changing the name so that our RDT, our Rural Density Transfer Zone, which I think you all would agree is a complex name, and you cannot describe to most people what a rural density transfer zone means just by looking at that name. We're changing that name to the agricultural reserve because the RDT covers those acres that we have put aside to preserve agriculture in this county. It's how people know that part of our county, and we wanted to make sure that the name reflected that. So the RDT zone becomes the agricultural reserve zone. And really the only other change to residential zones is that we combine the R150 zone with the R200 zone. R200 is 20,000 square foot lots. R150 was 15,000 square foot lots. But we had almost nothing zoned R150, and the standards you had to meet were the same. So we simply took the few properties that were R150 and made them R200. But your R60 zones, your R90 zones, all those zones that our residential neighborhoods are primarily composed of stayed exactly the same. No changes at all. And then, as I said, we did continue to do some modifications for our CR zones. I've covered some of those. And we invented new employment zones. So they're modeled on the CR family of zones. Our new office zones will require benefit points. As I said, one of the reasons that we liked the new CR zones was because it enabled us to get, we felt, better benefits for the public, and these new employment zones will enable us to do the same thing.
Would there be any of those in Tacoma Park?
You know, you had just finished your master plan,
Right.
and so you already had the CR zoning apply. I honestly would have to go back and look, but one of the things this is probably as good an opportunity as any to say it. If you go to our website for the zoning code rewrite, it's a wonderful website. If I say so myself, I had very little to do with it, but it's really amazingly informative. And one of the things the website is www.zoningmontgomery.org. Very straightforward. And one of the things that you can do is you'll see when you get to the homepage of that site, it has what's a box that says interactive map. And you can enter any address into that, and it will show you what the current zoning is and what the zoning will be under the new code. And it will tell you the development standards you had to meet before. It tells you the development standards you would need to meet in your new zone. And again, let me stress, these are not the residential zones that we're changing. There are non-residential zones, our industrial, office, and commercial zones.
If you can just back up one slide for a second, and if you can provide an example of the public benefit points and kind of how you're changing your approach to those. An example I was thinking of was if somebody was providing green space, maybe there's less incentive to put it on the roof as opposed to down on the ground where people can access it.
Well, as this has gone through Fed and Council, there's been a lot of debate. As you may be aware, one of the issues that really came out was there was a fear that the CR zone, by providing points for all sorts of public benefits, was taking away the incentive to provide affordable housing. And the Council felt very strongly that we needed to do absolutely everything we could do to promote affordable housing. And so there was some talk actually about taking away a lot of the public benefit categories that we had added. We definitely did add all sorts of new incentives for affordable housing. And some of, for example, you can actually reach your full points in a CR zone if you provide enough affordable housing that you actually wouldn't have to provide anything else.
Okay, thanks, that helps.
To answer my own question, it appears we have 0.15 acre of EOF in Tacoma Park, and it's on Grant Avenue behind the gas station. So
Okay.
it seems not consequential.
Yes, not. So again, for our industrial zones, I-1, I-2, I-3 were not very descriptive names. We now have industrial light, industrial moderate, industrial heavy. I think we would all agree that makes more sense. But other than that, they are very similar to our current industrial zones. And one thing we did do after much discussion, and I think it's a good change, we are finding, while everyone is very worried about losing our industrial zone land in the county because we don't have that much of it, and obviously there are businesses, et cetera, that need some of these industrial uses. When we went back and looked, we actually found that some of them had really become pretty much non-industrial. If you look over on Neville Street in the Rockville area, that's industrial zone land, but those are not really what you would think of as industrial uses. So we have said that you could do some things other than straight industrial on industrial land, but only up to 30%. So this makes it a little easier for some people to bring some uses to their land that may be sitting there underutilized right now, but we still want to be sure that we're protecting industrial land. So that is something we added into this code. And then on our new floating zones, and again, I will get into this more in just a bit, we did model them on our Euclidean zones. So in other words, we wanted to make sure they had clear limits on density, and we provided a number of prerequisites that you have to meet if you're going to be able to get approval for a floating zone. And we put in the same compatibility findings and master plan compatibility findings as our current floating zones have. So we don't really feel, other than the fact that we have created more floating zones, we don't really think we've created more permissive floating zones at all. So the pictures you see over here indicate some of the neighborhood protections that I was talking about. Because right now, if you live across the street from a non-residential neighborhood, someone can build a tall building and have it just tower over you. And what we're saying is that we're going to require setbacks and an angular plane so that if this building is going to get taller, it's not going to get taller immediately across the street. And we've also put in protections in terms of our floating zones where they have to, in some cases, they can only be across from an area that's non-residential already. And again, as I said, we've added the master plan conformance, and we are mapping all our heights and densities. This last point, I think, is very significant, and I want to go into that just a little bit. When we started working on our zoning conversion, in other words, here are all the current zones, and these are the zones that we're going to put you in. We tried to map it so that it was as close to the current zone as we knew how to get. So that if you could currently go to 120 feet tall in a CBD, we were going to give you a CR zone where you could go to 120 feet. But I don't know if everyone is aware of this. Our master plans sometimes are very property specific, and on a specific piece of property, they may say, yes, you're in a certain zone that allows you to go to 120 feet, but on this property, we think you should only be able to go to 90 feet. Now, when we were doing the conversion, we were looking at the zoning code. So if it said 120 feet in the zoning code, we were mapping it to 120 feet in the new district map amendment. What the Fed said is, no, we don't like that. Because you're not going through, as was pointed out by Lorraine Pearsall, the whole master plan process here. If you're going to remap these properties, we want you to map every one of them to exactly what the master plan height is, not the zoning code. So it means you now have a lot of buildings that are automatically taller than what we've just mapped into because they exist, and they were allowed to be taller before because they were allowed to go up to the zone height. But going forward, until that master plan is redone, the lower height is what we've mapped. So I do think that's very, very significant, and I feel it should address many of the concerns people had about this map amendment going forward without a master plan going with it. Because right now, all it does is puts in place the very more limiting master plan requirements versus the zone requirements. And then again, as I said I would discuss a little further the floating zones. We have 22 floating zones in our current code. Very few of them require that a master plan say this property would be suitable for a floating zone. If you can meet the purpose clause in most cases, and if you can get board approval and council approval, because of course all zoning has to be approved by council, then it can go forward. And very few of the floating zones that we have now have many requirements in terms of things you have to meet in order to go forward. But one of the problems we've had is we've had people who wanted to develop properties, but the current floating zones haven't given them much to work with. Our PD zone is probably the one that's been most used, the planned development zone. It has about a 4-page purpose clause. Trying to satisfy that purpose clause can be extremely difficult and tends to discourage a lot of development from going forward. So with our new floating zones, we have created, and as I said, we tried to somewhat follow our Euclidean zones. So we have 3 different residential floating zones. We have 3 different CR floating zones. We have employment floating zones and industrial floating zones. We think this gives more flexibility to a developer who wants to do something. We think it will help us as we do infill development going forward now that we're largely built out. But we work very hard to make sure that we put in restrictions, as I said earlier, that will keep you from being able to just go into the middle of a residential neighborhood and build something other than residential. It would be hard to do. We've made sure that we have mandated an extensive public process and that we have to find master plan conformity. And as I said, we have a series of prerequisites in these floating zones, and you have to meet a certain number of them in order to be able to go forward. This is much more restrictive than our current floating zones are. The last thing I wanted to mention, because it's something that happened as the code went through, and it's the one I probably had the most trouble understanding the difficulty with this. In our residential neighborhoods, as I said, we weren't really changing anything. But we did try and introduce the concept of a building type, because in our residential neighborhoods, we do not just have houses. We have churches, we have libraries, we have daycare providers, we have many other uses. And right now, as long as any of those uses are in one of our residential zones, they don't have to meet any other standards than those for a residential house in those zones. So if the setback in your R60 is 8 feet, then you can build a non-residential type use, and your setback only has to be 8 feet. So we tried to introduce the concept of a general building where we could increase the standards. So what we had hoped to do is say that if in an R60 zone you're building a house, your lot width at the front has to be 25 feet, but for a non-residential building it would have to be 60 feet, that your front setback would increase, that your side setbacks would increase, that your rear setbacks would increase, and that your parking setbacks, which don't exist obviously for single-family homes, you would have to have a parking setback for this other use. It was a concept that people had a lot of trouble with. They thought we were going to allow all sorts of unusual non-residential uses in. Not what we were trying to do at all. We were actually just hoping to write some additional protections in because these uses can already occur in a residential neighborhood. But that idea was taken out by council. So you will continue to be able to do exactly what you could do, and you will not have those added protections. So I just wanted to go through that. Like I say, it will be exactly like it is now. It won't be any more restrictive or any more permissive. But there really was a very definite reason why we tried to do that. But people were just not quite understanding of it. So just to wrap up, I know you wanted me to deal, Mayor Williams, a little bit with what it means for Tacoma Park. And I'm hoping that most of what I said, obviously it applies across the board to the entire county. Tacoma Park a little different because you did just have a master plan done, so you already had zoning that will pretty much stay exactly in place here. And we did write a fairly extensive grandfathering section of this code. It's another somewhat controversial point because it basically says that if you exist, you will not become non-conforming, you'll be grandfathered, and that you can rebuild exactly the way you are now. And the one thing that was an issue, and I'm not totally sure how it will finally end up, is that the grandfathering clause was put in place for 25 years. That's a long time, and there was a lot of discussion about whether it should be 10 years, because if we believe in this new code, then we want buildings to start, if they redevelop, to come along with this. But at least the way it stands right now, that grandfathering period is 25 years. So the 7-to-1 vote by the council was just on the text part of the code. They asked us to rearrange our chapters just a little bit. It's not a substantive change. It's really, they felt it would help in terms of usability if we grouped certain chapters slightly differently. So they gave us a month to do that, and we're very busy at this point working on that. This draft, which was after the Fed had made their recommendations for the code, is dated October 11th. There should be an entirely new draft that will come out this month. It is February already. And so I do encourage you to read that, but it will only be different from this October draft, really, because of this newly arranged order in terms of the way we laid it out. We then expect toward the end of this month a real vote by the council, but they did postpone a vote on the district map amendment. When we did the mapping assignments, we sent out letters to the 10,000 property owners who have non-residential property, and we've held office hours at the planning department for anyone who wants to come in and talk about their new zoning. And obviously there have been hearings just on the map, but there was a concern that everyone was so concerned with the changes that were going forward with the text that they might not have had time to focus on their actual zoning. We have been getting letters, I will say, from people who have started paying close attention and who have asked us to clarify certain things. So the vote on the map should not go forward until October. And that gives us about 6 months to work with individual property owners to make sure we're not creating any unusual hardship. But the code itself will not become effective until we also adopt the map. So there is an assumption that if we get a positive vote on the district map amendment in October, that both the code, the text, and the map would be adopted as the new code sometime late in October. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, let me just follow up on one point you made toward the end on a specific, and then one general, and then go to my colleagues for questions. You were talking about the 25-year grandfathering and the properties that would be non-conforming that get grandfathered. And I know that there was a lot of times, and I remember discussions about if there was a fire or something like that, and essentially the building was, there was nothing left. Does anything in that area change in terms of what they can do with a non-conforming use?
We recently, and when I say recently, in the last year, did pass a zoning text amendment dealing with exactly that issue. what we found, and I dealt with it far too much, and I'm thrilled with the zoning text amendment, is that someone unfortunately would have their structure burned down. They would work with insurance, they would go to DBS, they would learn all the things that they needed to do in order to rebuild, and then at the last moment someone would realize that the piece of land they were on had not yet been platted. It did not have a record plat because it had been built a long time ago. And to go through subdivision, which is what that meant, and get a record plat could take them another 4 to 6 months, which was, if it had been identified way at the beginning, that might have been one thing, but for someone who's eager to get back into their property, to then add at the very last second a 4 to 6 month requirement for platting seemed unusual punishment, you might say. So the zoning text amendment basically said that you could get a building permit even if you were not platted. So it's not really the new code that takes care of that. That will be reflected in this new code as well. But that's really a subdivision rule, not a zoning code rule. And so structures that burn down can be built back to the same size, same footprint for up to 25 years. If they want to change, then that would, if they wanted to expand significantly or relocate, then they would be expected to relocate on the property. They would be expected to have to do so under the new code.
So if they did rebuild exactly as they had, and it would be grandfathered for 25 years, then what happens at year 25 and a day?
Well, nothing unless it were to burn down again.
And then it burns down again, and then they couldn't?
Correct.
Okay. And my other general question is, on the straw vote 7-1 on the text, I know Councilmember Elrich was the
Yes, he was.
the no vote. Can you just give a quick sense of his reasoning for why he voted no?
I think he has been concerned about the floating zones. I think he feels it will encourage more development. And I think I could safely say, is not someone who wants to see a whole lot of new development in the county. And I believe that was his primary reason for voting against it.
Thanks. Councilmember Schultz.
Rose, I want to thank you. Light here. Rose, I want to thank you for your presentation. You and I got to know each other when we were meeting very frequently with your staff and city staff a couple of years ago. I guess it was 2012 on the Tacoma Langley sector plan,
Yes.
the CRT zoning, and urban design guidelines, and a lot of the stuff that I see in your slides that you had tonight, like the shaping the buildings back when they're confronting residential uses, which is stuff. So it was a very exciting working arrangement to get a lot of these issues resolved, I think, entirely to the satisfaction of the city and the neighborhood that I represent. I basically, well, one comment and two questions. One is, I guess I'm disappointed to hear that the council has wanted you to remove the provisions for governing non-residential uses in residential zones. I understand, I can see why it's a good thing to have it in there. I can see how people might think that it would be a bad thing because it seems to be wanting to encourage something, but it's not, and I think it should be back in there, but that's not for you to say.
No, it is not.
I understand. That's my comment, but I think that's what I would prefer. The first question I have is, since the Tacoma Langley zoning was formally adopted as CRT, has anything changed to the CRT zone? And I guess that was done about a year. I'm not even sure when that was formally adopted. I know it was at least a year ago, maybe longer, when the county council adopted that CRT zone, and at that time, it was one of the few CRT zoning areas in the county. I guess maybe it still is. But in terms of what's permitted in the CRT zone, and maybe what are the incentive bonus points, has anything changed that would affect our CRT zoning in the Tacoma-Langley area?
I don't believe anything significant. But that is something Pam Dunn could have answered much better than I can, but what I will do is look into that for you.
Yeah,
I
I'd
will
like to know
definitely
that.
get back to you with an answer. One of the things that we looked at as we were going through trying to make the conversion, again, trying to keep things as close as we could, was sometimes we were trying to decide whether something should be CRT or whether it should be zone neighborhood retail.
Right.
And in areas where we thought it should perhaps be neighborhood retail, we were suddenly really dramatically changing the uses. It could be on certain properties. The CRT more closely reflected the uses that are allowed under the current code. So, that was the kind of debate we had to really go through. And let me stress, we did this on a property by property basis. This was not looking at a whole section of a particular area. It was by property. And let me also stress, because I got more of these today, if people will look at their zoning, if they have a concern, they are absolutely right. Sometimes we miss something when we were looking at it. And if they bring it to our attention, we will try and better map their zone to make sure that we don't want people losing rights. But I will look specifically into your question about CRT. I can't answer it right here now.
Okay. One of the things that I'd also like you to add to that is you mentioned that affordable housing was raised to or adjusted to a level where it might be possible for somebody just by building affordable housing exclusively would be able to get all the points that they needed to get up the density bonuses that they wanted. And while we all in Tacoma Park we're all about affordable housing in this city, if that were the case in the Tacoma-Langley area, in the transit-oriented development area, I think it would subvert the goals of the Tacoma-Langley sector plan, which was all about mixed uses. Sure, we would want affordable housing to be part of that mixed use, but we wouldn't want it to be all affordable housing because then it's not mixed, and we wouldn't get any of the other amenities that we want. And hopefully I don't know.
I didn't mean to imply that a mixed-use building could suddenly become nothing but affordable housing. What I was referring to specifically was, as you know, right now, every development of 20 units or more is required to provide 12.5% as affordable. Under 25A of the code, if you provided up to 15% affordable, you could get a 22% density bonus. Under the CR zone, there's really not a concept of a density bonus. You have a maximum density and you have different ways of achieving it. And the concern was that because you could do many other things besides just provide more than 12.5% affordable housing units, and because we all know that providing affordable housing is one of the more expensive requirements we place on a developer, there was a feeling they would always opt only to provide the 12.5%.
I see.
So what the new requirements are that council put in, it basically says that for each 1% over 12.5%, you can get 12 points toward your CR points.
Okay.
And if you get to a certain level, that's when you can not provide other categories of benefits. But that's even more than, that's over, once you start getting into 20% affordable. But we're not talking about a whole building becoming affordable.
Good. The second area I wanted to ask you about, does the zoning rewrite involve, say anything or address the question of zoning enforcement?
Well, we have, a whole chapter on process, and I don't believe that anything will significantly change under the new code with respect to enforcement. We will continue to enforce.
More specifically, I'm concerned about commercial signage, which it falls, of course, the duties are in the Department of Permitting Services, which the current code doesn't seem to get enforced.
Well, that's an excellent question, and if you go back and replay the last full council discussion on the zoning code, signage was one of the questions that very much came up. And I'm smiling because I thought they were going to dramatically change what we had, and then they actually decided to leave exactly what we had, which basically is what we have currently, and they really felt they needed to pull together a group to look at the issue of signage more closely, separate from the zoning code rewrite.
I'd like us to have somebody from Tacoma Park in that group, because it's been a pet peeve of mine. My ward being, New Hampshire Avenue, and there's just a lot of irritants there that somehow or another we've got to come up with a better solution.
It's interesting because one of the topics that was discussed were these variable message signs. Right now, the current code says you can only change a variable message sign once a day. In the course of the council discussion, they talked about allowing people to change them once a minute. There was a further discussion about that's both a distraction if you live nearby, it's a distraction if you're a driver. But nevertheless, I thought that was going to actually pass. But then they literally tabled it. They said, let's go with what's here, which, like I say, is pretty much what we do exactly right now. But they are hoping to pull together some sort of group to look at.
I hope you can keep if not me, keep our staff informed on.
Absolutely.
on
I'll make
that
sure they know that
component.
Tacoma Park would like to be a part of any discussion on signage. That'd be great.
Thank you so much.
Councilmember Mail.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you for your presentation. A comment and then a couple of questions, and you're welcome to comment on my comment as well. You talked about, the existing 12,000 pages of code and
1,200, thank goodness.
1,200. That's better. But you also used the word flexibility a number of times in your presentation, and I guess my concern is that flexibility, and I expect this would mostly apply to the floating zones, flexibility can mean from a public perspective that it looks an awful lot like a developer can work with the county and sit down with and plan and get what they want out of a process without the public necessarily being able to see that. So, flexibility to me is somewhat of a dangerous word in a code. Predictability is sort of a better word, and certainly from an outsider's perspective, as a community, being outside of the planning process, but for the ability to comment, that's a bit of a concern, is that predictability element.
Well, like I say, we have done everything to make sure that the ability to comment is built in throughout our entire process. We've always done that. That doesn't change. I think and I certainly know both from my time in politics and my time in the planning department, that all too often there is a sense that yes, the public can speak, but we're not really listening to them because we want a developer to be able to do what he wants. I would disagree with that statement. We are very harsh on developers on many occasions, but I think the idea behind the floating zones, and if you go back and actually look at approvals that we've done, let's just take the Bethesda area because it's one of my favorites. As staff in development review, we were always having trouble kind of figuring out, well, do they want us to go to the zoning height or do they want us to stay at the master plan height? Because if you look, we would sometimes say, no, we do not agree with the developer, we recommend disapproval, they want to go to 120 feet, we recommend 90, and then it would get to council and they would give it 120. Then another project would come in right across the street, and we would say, well, the building across the street is 120, so it seems like it would be compatible to have another 120 feet, and they would say, no, 90. So, it really depends so much on the merits of a project. And what we were finding with this current code is we would see some really good projects come in, and we would tell them right at the get-go, I'm sorry, there is no way we can make this happen. The laws are clear the way they are now. We really don't have any flexibility that you can use to try and get this project approved. So I think what we want is to be able, we still require master plan conformity, Our current law and the new zoning code is very clear. You can meet all the development standards, height, setback, etc., and the planning board absolutely can still turn down a project. What we don't want is to basically turn down, before they ever have a chance to be heard, a project that we actually think might be of benefit to the county. It's a fine line, but if you've watched our hearings, you know we allow many, many people to speak. I have absolutely seen the planning board require a project be changed in response to citizen comments. I've seen them go against staff in terms of recommendations. So I don't think that the new code will do anything to limit that. And then, as I said, with these new floating zones, we feel we've added protections. Like I say, that you can't just be on any street. You need to be across from a non-residential building. I mean, we've tried to really put some things in to make sure that these won't be applied willy-nilly.
Okay. My other questions, and I won't pretend to be an expert on the details of this, but my understanding is when Tacoma Park was unified in the 80s, that there were essentially properties, commercial properties along New Hampshire were grandfathered in. And so, for example, there was a building right on the edge in New Hampshire that burned down a few years ago. They've now rebuilt the building essentially with a very, very much of a sort of a rapid process with not much public review because they were grandfathered in. That's my understanding of how that particular project went. And so I was wondering about this new proposal for grandfathering, whether for those specific properties that were part of the unification, whether they would in effect now have not just gone through being grandfathered for the last 20 years, but now would get another 25 years on top of that. And if that may not be something you know the details of, but if we could figure that out, I would be interested.
Right. I wish I had brought David Lieb, who's our attorney on staff, who's worked specifically on the grandfathering language, and I can have him contact you if you'd like,
Sure.
so that you can discuss specifics. I remember going to see that building, that if it's the same one that had burned down, and like I say, these situations always create a difficult situation. And Jeff Zients really had hoped that the grandfathering would only be for 10 years. But 25 is what the council has decided.
And unification was July 1, 97.
97. Okay,
Wow.
good. I'm off by some order of magnitude on all my numbers tonight. The last comment or question, we had our staff put together a very rough estimate a little while ago about potential build-out of properties along New Hampshire and University, and Eric can put it together. And it might be helpful to have that document just passed by your office and say, yep, we think this does look like what a maximum build-out scenario could look like under the new code. So maybe we could have staff share that with you, and you could just get back to us and say, and it's not, really truly ballpark stuff, but that would be very helpful.
No, that would be great. I mean, one of the things we've learned over time, of course, even with our CBDs, which do go away technically under the new code, because we won't have a CBD zone all over, we rarely got the densities that we actually had zoned for. And of course, with the office market changing so dramatically, and even some of the retail changing now that we have so much in the way of internet sales, et cetera. As a planner, I know I'm fascinated to see how that will all play out. It's not really associated per se with the zoning code, but I do think it's important that we work to create mixed use. One of the things we've pointed out, as we bring mixed use into some of these formerly Euclidean type zones, we actually should get more affordable housing, not less, because we're putting housing in areas where housing wasn't allowed before.
Thank you.
Councilmember Grimes.
Thanks. Thank you from me also for your presentation. My understanding is that the supermajority rule related to zoning and planning in the city of Tacoma Park and Kensington as well, is in state law, and that would not be altered by anything that we're talking about today.
That is correct.
So when it comes to the zoning map itself, the actual application of zoning in areas of Tacoma Park, if the city of Tacoma Park chose to have a resolution regarding the zoning map, then that would have to be overridden by, and it was contrary to what's being planned here, that would have to be overridden by both the planning board and the county council by at least a 2/3 vote.
I can't answer that question because I'm not an attorney. I understand your question. Of course, the comprehensive map amendment affects the whole county, so that many different areas other than Tacoma Park are getting rezoned. Again, I doubt there are too many surprises in your zoning since you
Right.
just
Well,
said your master
so
plan.
I'm going somewhere very specific with this. I mean, I don't have any issue with this. Certainly, the goals of flexibility and clarity and simplicity are very worthy goals, and they seem to be pretty well captured here. I'm actually going to channel a discussion I had with Ms. Pearsall, who's sitting here, so if I don't get it right, she'll correct me. So Tacoma Park has predominantly the commercial areas are along New Hampshire Avenue, Tacoma-Langley Crossroads. There is a very small commercial area along Maple Avenue, just down the street from here, and also another one at Flower and Erie, maybe also further out Flower. I don't believe, yeah, Flower and Piney Branch. Other than that, our commercial areas are in our Tacoma Junction area, and then along Carroll Avenue, Carroll and Laurel, and so on. Old Tacoma, and the plan here is to map the C1 and C2 zones into CRT. Ms. Pearsall was discussing with me that CRN could be more appropriate, in particular for those Old Tacoma locations. So basically, I'm posing that question for you. Had you considered CRN, which would be contrary to the general mapping of C1 and C2 to CRT, for those specific areas? And do you have any comment on that topic? Do you want to correct me or clarify? Maybe. Lauren, would you mind?
Come share.
Sorry,
That's quite all right.
cram in here.
That's quite all right.
Yeah, our original zoning was C1, not C2. C2, I think we saw over Fred in your ward, which is a more intense zone, but our low scale, and that's what I'm worried about, and also my one-story commercial storefront that we own in the historic district is now getting mapped with a mixed use, in 0.25 residential. What does that really mean for a one-story commercial storefront in the historic district that should stay that way? Even if we had a fire, we would restore it that way. And so why are we mapping? I think we need to have a closer look at what we're doing to the mapping in Old Town in general.
So let me make it clear that
And
my
CRM.
question really was a question. It wasn't advocacy, and it does appear that we would have another 6 months or so before the map. Of course, things march forward quickly, but before the map vote comes to further deliberate on this if we chose to. So it really was a question about CRN.
No, it's a good question, and as I tried to indicate, sometimes staff actually would apply one zoning in the conversion, and then your planning board in some cases changed it again because they wanted to make sure that someone wasn't, a property owner suddenly wasn't unable to do things they can do now. So they tried to find the closest fit. But I will tell you that daily we have people coming into us to say, on this piece of property, I'd like to show you, these facts. And we have been changing the mapped zoning if the case is strong. And so I would urge you and Lorraine and others, please, it doesn't mean we will always do it. We've had some people come in, I'm sure this won't surprise you, they don't like their current zoning and the current code. They are frustrated that we have done such a good job of matching their current zoning, and they think this would be an ideal time for us to change it to what they would like to see.
Okay.
And we've tried to explain to them that's not the purpose of this mapping effort, that you do through a master plan, that we are really trying to do as close a one-to-one mapping as we can. Obviously not totally possible when you go from over 120 zones to 39, but as close as we can. And then, like I say, the Fed took it even further by making sure the heights were down. But anyone who has a question about their mapping needs to come talk to us because we absolutely have been changing it as we go along.
Okay, I appreciate that. The only other thing that my concern about CRN, I think would actually also apply at Flower and Erie. But thank you.
There are some areas where we have gone back to CRN from CT. Like I say, it really just depends on how it, as we analyze it further. And that's why really council decided to give another 6 months to give people more time to look at the map, make sure that they understand what their new zoning is, and to make sure that they feel it's appropriate.
Thank you.
Councilmember Smith.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. My question has to do with halfway houses. Yeah, I know you haven't made any changes in the residential code, but I have received numerous complaints about the fact that there isn't a limitation on the number of halfway houses that someone can open up on a block. So if there are 4 houses available, you could put 4 halfway houses there. Is there any way during this process that we could consider, or we can communicate to the county council, to put some type of limitation on the number of halfway houses in one community or one block or one neighborhood?
There are certain federal limitations that prevent us from really doing that. So there are certain uses that under federal law, you can have a house up to 8 people.
Right.
And none of us can do anything about that. And obviously, once it starts, when we changed the accessory apartment rules, we did try and put some limitations, but we really don't have any control over halfway houses up to 8. Now, once it gets beyond that and they get into more of a special exception type of use, then we have a lot more control, but not, can't go against federal law.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think that takes care of all of our questions. Thanks very much for coming and spending this time with us and going through these explanations. And it sounds like for some people who have some questions, particularly about their mapping, that they have some time and the ability to make their case.
Exactly. I'm pleased you asked me here. It's an effort that I really do think we need if this county is going to move ahead successfully. Again, our staff just spent hours and hours trying to interpret what did the old code mean. I could cite some funny examples where, because of the many zoning text amendments we had, we would like change heights on a main structure, but in one case we forgot to change it on accessory structure, so you could only have a main structure up to 35 feet, but you could have an accessory structure up to 50 feet. So these are the sort of things that we are trying to bring in line as we move forward. Again, I encourage you to look at the website and the interactive map, and we do, as I said, have office hours, and people are happy to come to different communities if you want them to meet with them about the mapping. So, thank you.
Thanks very much. We'll take a short break and we'll come back for the rest of our agenda. Purchase of phone system upgrades, and we're joined by Abel Castillo, who's going to explain this in short order. Oh, you're going to intro him.
Intro it, and then I'm going to turn it over to the expert here a little bit. But just some points I think to highlight out of the background memo. So this item is for the purchase, upgrade, and installation of a replacement phone system. The current system was placed in service again about 14 years ago. Actually, sorry, 12 years ago in March of 2002. The price at that point in time was $123,000. We had similarly budgeted in our equipment replacement reserve for a similar amount. When we got bids back, we were significantly under that, which is fantastic news. Both of the bids were I think within about 1 percentage point in terms of price difference from one another. One of the bidders was an incumbent, Clear Connection, who is our current service provider. I think the recommendation is going to be for us to go forward and go with them, not only because they know our system, but they've previously worked with city staff in addition. We're also going to be recommending, I think, just a little bit more money, about $25,000, which still leaves us about $13,000 or $14,000 underneath the $120,000 that was budgeted, to account for any additional work in terms of networking capacity that may be needed. We've got some technical information about why we think that that might be a good investment from the city's perspective. And we've provided a few specifics on what the actual upgraded phone system will provide. One of the reasons why we're going through with this replacement now is because they no longer make our parts, which has made it difficult. I think we've been having to purchase them, I won't say in the black market, but we've had to find creative and innovative ways to replace our existing phone system, and that presents significant problems in terms of reliability, in terms of when we get a used part, we don't exactly know how used it is, gently used or more permanently used, which makes replacement just very difficult and challenging for our city staff. So I just wanted to provide that overall basis. Abel, I don't know if I've missed anything.
Well, I think you said most of it, and there is a correction, though, in the actual purchase price. That 2 should be a 0. So it's $103,673 and some cents. Went back to the fixed assets database and got the actual number.
Line 2, second line.
Correct. Other than that, I think a lot of the details in there in the agenda item kind of speak for themselves. We did ask for the additional funding in case we need it. The bid price was $81,924, almost $82,000. In the past, we've had some of these projects that are data intensive or that need some networking components added after we get into the project, and it's come out of Abel's budget or the IT budget. So this time I said, let me build the extra padding, or let me build the extra funding in case we need it. And what happens with these voice over IP systems, which is what we're replacing, or what we're adding, you need to power the phones over the Ethernet or over the connection. And those require different switches than what we have in many of our data closets. So we would be adding some of those Cisco switches that put power over Ethernet can be $5,000 after you buy the hardware and the software installed. So that in case, I hope we don't need to add any, but if we do, that's where the extra cost would go. There's also some management software that would probably need us to build a web server to run it, since it's got internet access, and will facilitate the management of it, the adding extensions or moving extensions when people move from one office to the other. I think that's about it.
So in understanding this, it's a lot of network pieces, or is it the actual piece that you see at somebody's desk?
It's in our network. It's in our infrastructure. You mean the extra cost?
What's being replaced? Is it the stuff that you see, or is it the stuff in the back rooms?
Both. We're buying an instrument for everybody's desktop, for everybody's desk, and we're also buying the switching equipment, the central brains of the phone system. The way a lot of these systems are designed, there's a central brain, or there's a phone switch that...
Kind of like the operator.
Kind of like the operator, right? Instead of plugging and unplugging the jacks, it's doing it all electronically. We have the capacity to have 48 concurrent conversations going on, 48 inbound or outbound, and that's what that switch manages, the connections.
Okay. Thanks. Councilmember Siemens.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you for the presentation and the work on this. In addition to our desk units, we also have a lot of cell phones. Does many of the employees have cell phones too? And
We have 60.
60 cell phones, yeah. And I know that many residential users are doing away with their landlines and just going with cell phone use. Is that a consideration the city can make? Are there systems that are just all cell phone based?
Well, yes, there are some systems that are out there, but a system with the capacity to manage the 10,000 or so conversations that we get every month with the quality of voice that some people expect, I don't believe that exists cellular. And I think that because we have a physical connection between our building and the central office of Verizon, we have an added insurance that our call is going to be made, that that traffic volume out on the airways is not going to interfere, that a big steel building or the infrastructure where you are is not going to interfere the signal, which can happen in a fringe cellular signal area. When somebody calls us, they expect to get a good hello, not a
fuzzy hello,
partial word. And we also don't want to rely on people's maintenance habits. Are they charging their phones? You know, is the battery on their phones good? Those kind of things are the things that we.
Okay, so this is over and above the cost of the 60 cell phones then?
Correct. Correct.
All right, thank you.
Councilmember Mayo.
Thank you, Mayor. And my comments were essentially the same as Councilmember Siemens. I guess before this, my understanding is this will come back as an ordinance next couple of weeks. Is that right?
Yes.
No work session tonight. And so I would love to see the city staff do some research to see if there are any municipalities out there that provide solely cell phones for their employees. And I hear you on the issue of data quality, but for example, for myself, an elected official, my constituents call me only on my cell phone. And I'm assuming that's true for most of my colleagues as well. So from a political perspective, we're operating on cell phone-based service for residents without, as far as I know, any major breakdowns.
So the municipality that I came from most recently, Washington, D.C., in my department, we went through a process about 4 years ago of thinking about this question about how do we think about our landline phones versus cell phones. And what we ended up doing was reducing at least some of our landline phones in favor of cell phones, but also giving especially new employees the option of do they want a landline phone or did they want a cell phone or did they want both. And by and large, and I think it was mostly the demographic, many of our employees chose just a cell phone. Right. I know that there are some considerations around people's familiarity and previous work habits as it relates to cell phone usage, which may change a little bit, but I know that certainly some other jurisdictions are thinking about it. I now actually know internally we've discussed it a little bit since I've arrived as well, so we continue to think about how we can provide the best sort of resource to our employees. I mean, I think that's ultimately what we're trying to get to, is that sort of balance between a cost-benefit analysis in terms of money, but also making sure that we have phones that are properly charged in, and when people call to ask us to resolve an issue, that we're able to do that in a clear and concise manner. There are also some additional, I know, features that we get with a landline phone that you just can't get, multiple bridge conference calling and so forth that you can get on a landline phone that you just can't get on a cell phone yet as well.
Yeah, I know in the past we've had council members call in and participate. Well, right now our capacity is just to have one person do that. And I don't know if the capacity to have more than one person call in changes your quorum laws, but we could have certainly more than one council member call in.
It would just be great before when we see this as an ordinance, if staff could do some work just to try to see if there's any municipalities out there that are on the cutting edge of this policy. Even if it doesn't necessarily affect this decision, it should inform the next one. I very much assume that if our replacement cycle is 14 years, that 14 years from now, there won't be landlines?
I think it'll be different then. I
It'll
mean,
be-
people are calling us. I mean, we get 10,000 calls a month, so some
Yeah.
people are calling our landlines.
Sure, they're calling our landlines, but we're not in a fringe cell phone area here at the municipal building, so.
Yeah, I don't know exactly our signal. Verizon's one of the better signals in this area.
Thank you.
Councilmember Schultz.
Yeah, I guess I'm not so enchanted with the idea of cell phones. I'm worrying about your inability to do conference calling, worried about your ability to get data. Like if you're, I noticed, for example, in here you've got the opportunity for up to 20 mobile users to be able to work from home, from remote locations. So I guess if somebody literally is working from home, they could do that. Or if you, and I was trying to think about how that would work. If you had some sort of a bad weather event and employees couldn't get to work, but they didn't want to make it a sick day, they wanted to continue to work at home, that becomes something, this having up to 20 of these access points, I gather, is kind of like the difference between people being able to do that and not being able to do that. And I'm not seeing how you can do that on a cell phone. I mean, I'm just sort of rhetorical questions. Plus, I'll be a little worried about asking the police department, which is all about intercommunications with radios and other things, not to have landlines if that's what they need.
Correct.
I mean, it's one thing for office workers, but I think the police are in a different mode. Anyway, I guess the only question is that when you wrote the RFP for bids on this, was it focused around just NEC phone systems, because that's what we've had, as opposed to, say, AT&T, Avaya, or some of these other, there's a multiplicity of systems out there. Just curious about it.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Thank you for asking that. Because we have an NEC system, we are now just updating our licenses. There is licensing involved with the software and the usage. So by using NEC, which is we currently have, then we can, there's a less, it costs less to just upgrade the licenses to the new system than to go out and buy Avaya licenses for the whole system. When it comes to the voicemail component, the phone lines also. So we are saving some money by just upgrading our NEC system than going out and buying an Avaya or a Cisco, something else.
I get it. Okay, I thought there was a good reason. I just didn't know what it was. Yeah, thanks.
Councilmember Mayor, you have something else?
Yeah, sorry, I forgot to ask one more question, which is the additional $25,000, I guess, the description we have doesn't give me a lot of transparency about what that is, and whether 10,000 or 15,000 or, why that number, and whether that's the right number for us to approve. So I just didn't know if there was any particular reason why it was 25 and not something different.
Well, I alluded to it a little bit by giving you a ballpark figure on what it would cost to add a voice over IP or a power over Ethernet Cisco switch, which is in the $5,000 range. We have several closets and then remote sites. So basically, if we were to put power over our Ethernet at every phone closet we have, which is 5, at 5,000, that's really the figure that I use. And we still would be under what the capital project or the equipment replacement fund has for us.
Right.
It may not be that much.
I'm just curious about why would we, if that's not part of the base package, why would 5 new powered voice over IP closets be needed?
It was just a number. I mean,
Okay.
there's 5 closets, and it could be a potential for putting one in there. Now, we may have, our cabling and our wiring is fine right now, so we may not need any of those. But it is easier to reconfigure phones if they're on Ethernet, if they're just data that's changing on them. The software has come a long ways, and even the regular digital phones are pretty easy to configure, but that was the reason for doing that, the fact that we could be adding that many.
Okay.
Thank you. Abel, just to also maybe clarify on that, so the additional funds, the $25,000, would be for the existing vendor. So is there a time issue? Let's say that the council chose to not approve the additional $25,000, and we had a situation where we needed to go back to the vendor for one of the things that's identified in this 25. Is there a timing issue that the city would have in terms of having
There may
to?
be some leeway or some, they have to order the equipment and get it. I don't think we'll be without a system because we have an existing phone system. But there is a leeway required to order the things, to order the equipment.
And I just have one additional piece to some of the questions that have been about whether other jurisdictions have switched to just cell phones instead of the landlines. The piece that came to my mind as I was thinking about that was, and when they do that, do they then have to wrestle with a policy piece about when people are expected to answer their cell phones and not? Because when you've got a landline and you're into work, that landline rings at 7 o'clock at night and you left the office at 5 or 6, it goes to voicemail. If it's a cell phone, do the employees feel like they're supposed to answer that at whatever hour it rings?
It does change it.
It can kind of change the whole interaction. And
Changes the culture.
yeah, so it's just, and I'm not saying that, I'm not pressing for an answer about what that would be, just saying to, if in your thinking about any of that, whether that has been an issue and what people have done.
To answer that, I think it would be something we would have to think about, absolutely. It exists. Yes, it does exist, that issue.
Anything else? Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. We will now go to our work session item on the continued discussion of the revised community grants program. And we've had some revisions to what we had based on the discussions that we had last week, and we've had an additional question or two come up since that. So you want to go through the changes you've made, and then we'll also ponder the other questions that have come up.
Good evening. In the cover memo that was included in your agenda packet, I tried to highlight on those primary changes that were made as a result of the conversation the other week. You'll note that we have adjusted the funding levels to reflect decisions regarding the potential for pulling out funding support for business associations, thereby dropping the program and operational support from $105,000 down to $50,000. And then there was an interest in maintaining funding levels at last year's or this year's budget allocation, and we took the balance out of the capital projects, dropping that $8,000 down to $42,000, leaving us with a proposed program budget in FY15 of $172,000. And that would include mini grants, arts and cultural events, program and operational support, as well as the capital project programs that we're proposing. We have eliminated benefit corporations for all of the categories as far as an eligible applicant for any of the grant programs. We have added language requiring a livable wage be paid by organizations that access grant programs. And I have apparently worded this badly in the general requirements. But the intent was to acknowledge that business associations and nonprofit grant recipients
be required to pay a living wage for those program activities associated with that grant. If you look at the city's current livable wage ordinance, nonprofits are exempt. And my understanding, based on the conversation, was that there was a desire on the part of the council to have anyone receiving grant funds pay a livable wage. And the very nature of the organizations that would be eligible to receive grant fundings, in all probability, the only ones that will have a paid staff, if you will, would be business associations and nonprofits. So what I was trying to get at in the proposed language was that that exemption for nonprofits that is in the current ordinance would not apply if they were to receive grant funding. Right now they are exempt, and anyone receiving less than $20,000 from the city is exempt from the livable wage requirement. Is that right? Yeah.
But would we, for the grants, would we maintain the $20,000 minimum? Because, you know, if you get below that, you are not going to be paying so much in wages anyway.
There was no discussion at the council level, so it was proposed as being eliminating all of those requirements and requiring all nonprofits and business associations to pay a living wage, regardless of the award of the grant. But that's a council decision. Staff doesn't feel strongly one way or another.
And that certainly doesn't include volunteers.
No. But I'll just...
They're valued at $20 and something, which is even less.
Yeah, it's
Right. 2214.
Can I just a point of clarification? Is there any sense from the council we can get now on just that issue of?
I certainly wouldn't do it for the mini grants. I mean, it's not going to be that very much money that you're paying anyone.
Yeah,
for the
probably
other.
very few people are paying in that way for mini grants too.
But it's either the principle of a living wage or it's not. It's not about how much money. We're not paying people to pay a living wage. Our grants. That's not what the grants are about. It's about the principle of whether employees deserve a living wage, regardless of who they work for. So, I mean, I'm for doing it consistently rather than differently.
So you want to, those in favor of consistency?
Don't have to vote? I don't know.
No, you don't have to vote,
Okay, good.
because there's already everybody else in favor.
But stick around for a while.
Just-
Yeah, you'll have another chance.
All right.
Just to clarify for my own purposes, tracking it for the mini grant program would be could potentially be problematic, and especially if you don't have a minimum dollar amount for it. So,
And that gets to another point, which is that if we're in the mini grant program, we're providing the amount and somebody else may administer it, and if they do,
Then they
they're
would have to
tracking
track
all of
that
that
as well.
stuff.
Right.
So it would be putting the tracking on them.
correct.
The mini grants are, you know, the examples are tenant associations, neighborhood associations, grassroots community groups, PTAs. I mean, maybe some grassroots community groups would have paid staff, but
It's
most of
highly
the rest are
unlikely,
not.
yeah. So, at least as far as I'm envisioning it, and what I understand the council is, you're focused primarily on business associations, nonprofits who are outside of the mini grant process.
I have a question on that requirement, too. Are you talking about the monies, the granted monies, any money that goes to individuals, is that the livable wage? Or are you talking about all members, all employees of that organization have to be a livable wage?
What we have proposed here is that people associated with providing that, people responsible for making sure that that grant project or program is implemented would be responsible for it, rather than looking at staff in another part
Program
of
area.
the organization working on something that's totally different.
So if I can just, I think this clarifies it. If what we were saying was consistency about living wage, maybe except for the mini grant program, because it's envisioned as handing a number of dollars over to somebody else, and it's not the type of organizations that are going to be paying.
Correct. They're more informal organizations, if you will.
But then it comes at no cost.
That would access those
to cover them.
funds.
Well, can I have just a
Sure.
slight tangent, would it be easier if we just said, if we put it in policy as a preference as opposed to a requirement? So the grants would prefer, something about the process would prefer organizations that pay their full-time
demonstrate they
employees
pay
a living wage. And then it doesn't automatically exclude someone who doesn't for some good reason, but it generally, a preference like that would be presumably.
I
just-
would prefer to require it with a preference for the mini grants, perhaps, if any. And mainly the preference for the mini grants would be to allow you not to bother checking, because it just is not of much money.
That might actually be more appropriate, because if you give a preference, then the implication is that when you're going through and reviewing grant applications, that those organizations that do would get higher points or higher rating, however the committee were to look at them, as opposed to being an actual requirement, so that it's actually part of the agreement and part of the budget if they include staffing costs in their proposal.
I like Seth's proposal. Yes, Fred.
Thanks. I'm picturing a nonprofit organization that has staff, let's say, whether it's in Tacoma Park or not even in Montgomery County, but is providing services here, where they get a grant from us, and that there's a staff person who manages grants. And this is just one of many grants that staff person manages. And so our requirement would be that that person has to be working at obtaining a living wage, even though maybe only 10% of their time is devoted to this grant. I'm not sure how we're going to enforce it. Or are we just going to chase people away who are going to look at that and say, well, it's just not worth it. Let's not even bother applying for this, because this is an intimidating factor. How do you pay somebody a living wage for the hours they work on the Tacoma Park grant that they get, and not a living wage for the rest of the time? So then you say, well, that person has to have a living wage 100% of the time. Well, who are we to say that? I'm trying to connect what we're trying to, the principle of what we want to do here with the reality.
What is the current living wage?
13 something.
$13.20 an hour.
65, 13.20, something in that range. But we require it of contractors. But across the board, it doesn't have to be only for work they're doing for the city. We require that they pay a living wage and they self-certify. I don't think it would be difficult to have, we're not going to go out and check to ensure. We're relying on their self-certifying that they're paying a living wage, just as we do for contractors.
Right. And frankly, with the Community Development Block Grant Program, when you factor in the Davis-Bacon wages, there are people that are paid receive different compensation depending upon the project that they're working on. So, and that is also based on certification.
You're thinking this is something that's viable, workable?
It's not an unusual requirement.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess in principle, we're talking about principles here, aren't we? Is that I'd love to have these ordinances that require living wage, but if we can't enforce it realistically, then it becomes just kind of a facade of something. Like, well, we're really sincere about this, but in other words, I'd like us, if we're going to do this, to make it so that that the respondents actually have to comply with it.
The process, as I would envision it, would be very similar to what Jesse's talking about in terms of certifying the living wage, the process that we use now for contracts for services, and reviewing that. For Davis-Bacon, for example, when we go out and we'll do actual on-site visits and identify gaps, or if we have an employee that has discovered that they're not getting paid what they're supposed to be getting paid on a contract basis, then we deal with it as a complaint comes in. So I think it's doable.
Okay.
Mini
So I
grant.
just-
Excuse me.
I want to make sure that we have closure on that one. And so.
Right.
since
I think we said
Seth-
it's
Seth
required.
made- Seth made the last-
Requirement, but express it as a preference when it comes to the minis.
No, it was a requirement
It was a requirement across the board, but I'm checking.
Self-certifying, a checkbox on the
Right,
application.
and now I'm checking
Yeah.
on Seth's further refinement of that.
The minis was an accommodation. I'm happy to dispose of, to make it simpler and just make it across the board.
I like your proposal.
I'd like your proposal, too.
Okay, then fine, yes.
But it doesn't
Anyone
matter,
else?
because it is, the ones that are going to be getting the small grants probably don't have
Right.
an employee, and if they do,
In which
they
case
should
it
be,
doesn't-
they should
Yeah,
make
so
the
across the
wage.
board.
Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted clarity on it.
So
we're-
across the
We're
board.
okay with across the board.
Across the board.
Okay. Moving on to mini grants. My definition of the word administration has created, or my use of the word administration in the definition on the grant proposal as well as in the memorandum has created some discussion regarding what does that actually mean. What we have done with the revised proposal is reference that the mini grants would be provided under contract with an outside entity who would be responsible for all aspects of the grant program, ranging from the selection of the applicant or selection of the grant recipients, as well as reviewing and dispersing funds, doing whatever administration is required, and reporting out to the city council on how those funds were expended to ensure that those dollars were provided to entities that fit within the city's objectives. So the use of the word administration is more than just doing the paperwork. It's actually going through and taking it from the beginning to the end.
But they're operating based on the parameters that we give them.
Right. It would be under a contract for services. So you'd have a scope of work, what the expectations are, and how the funds would be dispersed in terms of...
Our preferences are for X.
Right.
So,
And do we have another organization other than Tacoma Foundation that administers the program?
If this goes through and the council approves it, then we would go through and do a solicitation.
clarification then. I think I understand what you're saying. So the mini grants and the Tacoma Foundation, which is an example, is totally outside the grants review committee.
Correct.
There's no overlap
Right.
there whatsoever.
Correct. The council would be asked to enter into a contract for services with
Okay.
entity XYZ, whose job it is to do the grants process for that particular
I appreciate the
contract.
clarification.
Sometimes we use words that we know what we mean in our heads, but not everybody interprets them the same way.
I do that
For-
frequently.
Yeah, I do it all the time. For program and operational support grants, what we've done is we've pulled out business associations, and as discussed the other day, would include within the city's budget under a different line item contracts for services for economic development programming that this would supplement the city's ongoing efforts. So that's one of the reasons why the original dollar amount we had budgeted dropped down so dramatically. So, for example, the Tacoma Park Old Tacoma Business Association, which now gets operating support through an agreement with the city, that would no longer be considered a program or operational support grant. It would be an actual contract for services that we would negotiate. And the reality is many of those activities that are included in that current memorandum of agreement would undoubtedly transfer over to a contract for services for economic development services as well.
So previously, we had grant proposals from the Tacoma Women's Business Network. They've changed their name, and I don't remember what they've changed it to. But would that fall under this? Because, I mean, how would you handle something that's, let's call it out of band like that? It's not a established business association, but it's one all the same.
From my perspective, that would fall out of the contract for services for economic development services, because there's no real geographical business district area that they are limited to.
We'll call it,
They would
a
continue
floating
to-
zone.
Right, a floating zone. But they would continue
You
to
mean
be
Euclidean
eligible
zone,
for
sorry.
program or operational support. Yeah. And at some point in time, the potential is there. But based on my understanding of what they currently do, they would still be eligible under the program and operational support category. So frankly, here we're envisioning the Old Tacoma Business Association, which has a geographical district, the Crossroads, Tacoma-Langley Crossroads CDA. At some point in time, the Long Branch Business League could potentially be an applicant, or if there was a business association that was established along the New Hampshire Avenue corridor that's outside of the CDA's current jurisdiction, it'd be organizations like that. Okay. And then, last but not least, we've narrowed down the eligibility requirements, if you will, for their grants review committee, eliminated the one representative per ward, and just focused on the fact that they're a resident of Tacoma Park and that they have an area of expertise or an expertise in an area that would be beneficial to these different grants. There was some concern expressed last week that what would that mean for my particular ward or an individual ward that might not be represented on the review committee. And in going through the grants that have been awarded in the past, they're more of a community-wide focus as opposed to specific projects that benefit an individual ward. There are some that will do it on a neighborhood basis, but again, most grants are broader than that. And it would not have an impact on the mini grants that might be for, I believe in Ward 6, for example, there were grant funds provided for the little message kiosk boards.
Yeah.
That would be outside of the review committee's purview, theoretically, because of the size of the request.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe the rest of that's fairly straightforward. We did want to note that we're proceeding with the FY14 small grants process. And in special considerations, there's a tentative schedule as far as how that would proceed. It would involve us coming back to the City Council later in February to formalize appointments to the review committee, which would then carry over into FY15. But we wanted to give you the heads up that they will still proceeding with the mini grants or the small grants program under the current scenario, and that any changes that we're proposing, again, if they're endorsed by the council, would not take effect until FY15. The other thing that I just wanted to note, based on the comments during the public comment period, is we have $70,000 budgeted for, or proposed budgeting for, arts and cultural events. When we were going through and developing numbers for these different categories, one of the things we took into consideration for that particular category were the number of community festivals that we have in the area, whether they are currently receiving funding or not. So we have the Street Festival, the Folk Festival, and the Jazz Festival. So if you were, for example, to assume that each of those festivals were to come to the City Council and request maximum amount of funding, there are ample funds within that budget, proposed budget, to accommodate those festivals as well as other arts and cultural projects that might be undertaken. If you have, for example, in Ward 4, you have a Maple Avenue Festival, that would still, at least based on past practices, that would still be able to accommodate new things going on, as well as recognize these long-term events that have been very important to the community.
The Porch Music Festival.
Excuse me?
The Porch Music Festival.
Yes, that would be an ideal one, exactly. So, there are lots of possibilities, and personally, I'm excited about that category because it gives us an opportunity to sort of give people an opportunity to be creative about things that the city is not in a position to do for a variety of reasons, and to give them the seed money that they do to take the ball and run with it.
And Sarah, just to clarify again, so all of the decisions, including from the arts and cultural category, come back to the council for their final
Right.
approval and recognition.
Proposals would come to the review committee for requests would come to the review committee. They would do the review, do any negotiations regarding, okay, you want $100,000, but that's outside the limit. Negotiate, if you will, and make recommendations to the council, so that whatever awards are done are actually sufficient to accomplish what they're hoping to accomplish, or that the scope of their proposal has been modified to work within a reduced funding recommendation.
And again, it's just a recommendation to the council. The council actually awards
The council
all of
would
the grants.
make all awards,
With the exception of the mini grants.
with the exception of the mini grants. And even there, you make a decision or formal action in terms of who would be responsible for overseeing that program.
And what our direction to them would be.
And however, yeah, exactly, yeah.
What type of reporting would they be required to give council?
I would do something very similar to what you have as far as the grant recipients themselves. It could be a quarterly reporting in terms of, this is the progress we've made to date, these are the funds that have been dispersed, this is what actually resulted in the disbursement of those funds.
You gave a list of recurring festivals, activities in the city that residents, expect to happen. How much money would you estimate that we've given in the past, and we could just consider making these line items in the budget?
Historically, I went back and looked at community festivals, and the Folk Festival is the only one in recent years that has received actual line item funding from 2010 up to the current day. Prior to that, there was money spent in that line item for Historic Tacoma, for the Washington Adventist. At that point, it was the Columbia Union College. There was money spent for OTBA for a health festival, things like that. What we're hoping to do is to get away from those line items and encourage everyone to go through this grants process so that everyone has an equal access to the funding that's available, and it gives it increases access and transparency in terms of the selection process.
So are you including or excluding the 4th of July festivities?
The Independence or 4th of July Day festivities would remain a line item as originally proposed. And I believe, I did a quick and dirty chart prior to the meeting, and I believe if you've got a copy of that, it just shows how it has fluctuated over time.
I'm not sure whether, well, since we're on the topic, I would ask that the
yes.
Tacoma Park Folk Festival be similarly treated the same, not similarly, as the 4th of July.
And I would support that proposal. I mean, residents, they expect these events to happen, so, I mean, if we didn't fund them.
But they would, and I'm not disagreeing with you, but I just want to point out that they would still have access, like the Street Festival and the Folk Festival, which are also community events or festivities that don't currently have a line item, that the community has come to love and enjoy.
Okay, then
So
I would
Street
ask.
Festival and Jazz Festival.
Jazz Festival.
Those are not as well established as the others, and the Street Festival seems better able to operate autonomously. I would ask then that the 4th of July be included along with the others, along with all the rest of the festivals.
Can I get just a point of clarification from the council on
Could we get
that
a
issue?
chance to talk to?
Sure.
Yeah, so we just got onto that one. Councilmember Siemens.
Thank you, Mayor. First of all, I want to thank you for bringing this back to us and for the changes and improvements that you've made in this proposal. One of the questions I had was about the outsourcing. I understand we've been doing this under the contract with an organization. I just want to make sure, since it is public money, that the administering of that public money is legal by an outside organization that gets reviewed by the Corporation Council.
Absolutely.
Okay. And along the same lines, since it is public money, I think all of these grants need to be spent for city business and city residents, does it not? And I'm thinking specifically of, we have talked about having tree planting programs, and we were not able to expend public funds to plant trees on private property. And so there's got to be some requirements in these grant programs that the expenditure of funds is to the benefit of the community, not to individuals. And that leads me to wonder about, you know, I could certainly see where we could be granting money to organizations that are outside of the city limits, but I'm wondering if there need to be requirements that any of the grant funding that is benefiting individuals be they be city residents. And I know we've seen that in some of the past grants that we've done for, such as Educare this year with the food program, that they have to benefit city residents.
If you look at the proposal that we have in terms of funding priorities, that is included as one of the top priority or programming objective. There have been, let me back up. For all of the grant programs that the HCD department is currently administering, we have in those documents language to that effect, and include with it a street directory so that people can actually document if someone is from Tacoma Park, because there's this ongoing battle that the post office says I live in Tacoma Park, but I don't.
Right, sure.
All of that. So we're tracking that, and I don't see it being problematic for a majority of the grants. The challenge that you might run into in some cases is it Rolling Terrace that's outside the city limits?
Yes.
Where a lot of Tacoma Park students go there. They're not all Tacoma Park residents, but there have been grant funds expended at that school with funding provided by the city of Tacoma Park, because there is a primary benefit to the students that live in Tacoma Park that go to that school. Right. So some of this is going to have to be nuanced, but the primary objective is to provide funding for programming or projects that primarily benefit residents of Tacoma Park.
Okay. And then as far as the folk festival goes, I think I completely agree. I like the idea that we have an open policy for these grants so that there is a competitive nature. But I do believe that the folk festival, unlike many of the events in the city, is a signature event that is something that not only defines Tacoma Park, it is representative of Tacoma Park. And I think if you ask people about Tacoma Park, one of the first things they think about that they'll mention is the folk festival itself. And in that sense, I am strongly in favor of graduating them to kind of a free pass on the grant process. And I would say that remove them as we have the Old Tacoma Business Association to a separate contract, and at the same time diminish the amount of that money that we have. At this point, we haven't even allocated. We've estimated for the arts and humanities grants, and it. I don't think it's to the detriment of the folk festival to have a specific amount. I think it's beneficial, though, for the community to make a strong commitment for that festival and to do that up front. And I would like to make that as a motion.
I would second it.
Where are we moving?
Work session.
It's not a resolution at this point, but
No,
I'd like to get some discussion on that point and get a
That's what I want to
resolution
do,
to it.
but I think at this point, it's a work session, so we're doing straw votes.
Okay, I would like to straw motion that.
And I just wanted to get one clarification that I think you've provided on when you were talking earlier about the targeting of the grant funds toward residents of Tacoma Park. And as you were talking about that, I was thinking, but for festivals and 4th of July and things like that, it's mainly a Tacoma Park event, but
Right.
by no means is it only for residents of Tacoma Park, so that you're
We're not going to check IDs at the gate, right?
right, so that for those types of events, that what you were saying isn't necessarily the case.
I just want to make sure we stay within the legal bounds of what the requirements are.
You had a light, Councilmember Grimes, you had a light, then it went off and now it's back on. Did you want
Yeah, sorry, let me,
to? If we're on the folk festival topic, or were you going to go somewhere else?
well, no, I mean, I agree with the Folk Festival, obviously.
Okay.
No, it was about the 3 years of consecutive funding. I raised that last time.
Well,
I'm
but
not-
let's
Oh,
just stick,
okay,
let's
so we're
stick
not
with the
done
folk
that.
festival and
Fine,
do that
that's
one.
fine. Right, so I
Because-
support the treatment of the Folk Festival as a ongoing activity, noting that it was founded in the 1970s by Sam Abbott, and around here it's hard to get more institutional than by invoking Sam Abbott's name, unless it's B.F. Gilbert's name.
Okay, because I had a little trouble interpreting what you were saying before, but originally I thought you were saying the opposite, so.
I'm saying treat it the same as the
Okay.
4th of July parade, and I
Yes.
do believe it should be treated separately, and so I don't need to go on.
Okay, and then Councilmember Smith, I heard you kind of agreeing with him. Is that
Yes.
what you were agreeing with?
I think that the three of us are in agreement.
Yes.
Okay, okay.
Yes.
And I'm in agreement with it as well. Are there other comments about that one?
I think it's a great idea.
Okay, we're unanimous. It's a great idea
Fantastic.
to designate the folk festival and to pull that 10,000 out of the arts and humanities area.
Would it be 10,000 or 15, which is what they could apply for under the current proposal?
I heard earlier
I think
that they would
10,000.
be happy with 10.
What?
In terms of the, kind of the straw designation.
Hold on.
Okay, so
We're holding on.
based on that, we'll
least not
drop
yet.
the suggested budget for arts and cultural events grants to 60,000.
Right. Now, Councilmember Schultz wants us to hold on.
I just think we're getting into doing budgeting here
Well, that's why we're
very prematurely.
designating straw.
Let's just say that we're going to take the folk festival out and leave the dollar amount alone for the time being. We can talk about whether it should be 172 or 162
There was,
next
I think that was only
March.
because there was agreement last week that we wanted to keep the amount constant. We didn't want it to escalate, and that's what staff came with in this revised.
We're just taking this as comments, so we appreciate any comments. We will not be making any decisions tonight, but it's good to have some direction.
Okay, so we're in agreement on that one. Now, Councilmember Grimes.
Right, so I was not clear about what that proposed three-year limit for specific grant activity or general operational support applies to. In particular, it says specific grant activity is an event, a grant activity. If we were to say, for instance, to fund the Jazz Festival, would we be cut off after 3 years for that? I should say I'm not in favor of the 3-year limit. I'm in fact not in favor of it at all for anything.
I think that the concept came from when we were talking about the
Right, and-
framework, at least, was just from the previous council comments we heard about trying to eventually make sure that some entities do look for additional sources of funding besides city funding.
So that we don't end
And
up gridlocked into the same ones and nothing left.
Right. And the 3-year limitation is for operational support, not for, it would only apply to the.
Okay, so for instance, specific grant activity, organization X could ask for money 1 year for some activity. The next year, they'll ask you for, the same organization asks for a different activity. They could ask that for 30 years.
Correct.
That it's the activity focus.
It's the activity.
I just wanted a clarification here. But an event is an event in activity in this sense. Yes.
The 3-year consecutive funding for a festival would not, the 3-year limitation will not apply to a festival, regardless of what it was
No,
called.
that would be my preference.
Any opposing views? Okay, so we're in agreement with what you said.
What did I say?
The
Watch
last
the
thing
tape.
you said.
The last thing I said.
It's called whatever.
Other questions, other points, other things that we need to deal with?
What, just one quick question.
Sure.
On the committee, or whatever we're going to call it, if we're not going to base it off awards, how do we determine picking these people?
It's up to us.
It'll be up to the city council.
Okay.
I don't see any changes in how the selection process is now. Basically, city clerk would solicit applications from people with these areas of interest. That goes to their applications or submissions go to the city council.
Well, what happens to the idea of giving the opportunity for the current committee to sit initially?
And
Is the
there's
council
how many
agreed on that?
On that
or-
one? There's 3?
Oh, no, there's
No?
7 or 8. I didn't pull the list. There's,
And what wards are represented?
Have they all expressed interest in continuing under this
no,
proposal?
because I didn't know where the council was going. So we need to find that out. But
So
they're-
you're asking, do you need to contact them and ask if they would like to?
Well, I'm asking, do they get an option, or are you going to should I solicit applications and we're going to start from scratch?
From my personal perspective, I would just say I would solicit applications, but indicate to the existing committee members that the council is pleased with their work and is likely to just reappoint.
Okay.
If Ringo Starr and John Bon Jovi move to town and we want to add them to the committee, maybe they get bumped, but.
And frankly, that works really well because they have the history and are familiar and comfortable with the process. And there's some really very good people that served on the review committee last time.
But I like the, I like the idea of at least opening it up. We might find some additional ones as well.
I'm wondering if it wouldn't make sense to add a couple members from 9 to 11, just to give us a little more. Goodness, that look on your face.
I'm sorry. Based on past experience, 9 is a great number. You get higher than that, then you run into challenges regarding quorums and it's too large of a group and things like that.
I would support opening it up and trying to get solicitations from other people.
I agree with solicitation, general solicitation, and I agree with trying to keep the number at 9.
Didn't mean to make such a bad.
Were you related to Abner Doubleday in any way?
I don't know who that is. But,
Founder
Okay.
of baseball,
oh.
1869, Cooperstown, except he didn't really found baseball.
Councilmember
bought
Schultz,
that-
you missed the
bought
city
that
clerk
body
space
of
as
it.
well.
So are we in agreement on that? Not on the baseball piece. Okay.
Okay, so not to belabor it, but we've clarified the living wage requirement, program and operational support everyone's comfortable with, and for the arts and cultural program, we're going to pull and the folk festival out of that. Everything else is fine. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good job.
All right, our last item of the evening is the legislative update.
I'm having a brief list being passed around this evening. I think my part in this may go relatively quickly. Go through a few standard items. One is the Tacoma Park Class B on and off sale legislation. Mayor Williams has agreed to testify in support on February 17th. We have a Senate bill on the 21st. Is there somebody who would be interested in testifying also on the 21st at 1 p.m.?
I'd be happy to do it.
That's a Friday afternoon.
Last time I mentioned very briefly a proposal on municipal elections to include offices and questions, municipal offices and questions on the state ballot. And I was just wondering, we discussed it briefly, but is this something that you would want to have a statement of support for, just to give the authorization?
Yes.
Yes.
Any no's?
I guess I'm not clear.
What this allows is it allows, instead of having a separate municipal election for something, we may be able to take advantage in certain cases of using the state ballot, perhaps for a municipal referendum question or that kind of thing.
But does that allow that people that don't live in Tacoma Park to vote on our ballot?
Well, it would have to be crafted in such a way that it would be just for Tacoma Park.
Oh, okay.
Which
Well,
might be hard
I
to do
don't
because the
know
voting
that this,
precincts
yeah,
don't
I don't
work
know
that
that
way.
this would ever work, but generally we are supportive of kind of increased authorization and availability of things as a community, so as a city.
I understand. Thank you.
Okay.
So on general principles, yes.
There's Senate Bill 212, Fairness for All Marylanders. Is it Marylanders? I've never said that word very well. Act of 2014, prohibiting discrimination based on gender identity. It's quite a lengthy item. We've have a city council long tradition of supporting things like that. Did you want me to submit a statement of support?
Yes, I think we should.
I wanted to bring a bill that I've asked Michelle Douglas to look at a little bit closer, which is Senate Bill 629, Vehicle Registration Fee Surcharge. Basically, this would allow municipalities and counties to put a fee on vehicle registrations for vehicles identified with properties within the jurisdiction, up to a $20 maximum per vehicle. The one thing that caught my eye was that it's up to a maximum of $20, and if the county gets there, the county gets priority. So if the county takes the full $20, the municipality doesn't get to do anything. And I thought that was a little strange.
I think it's a bad idea.
I like the idea of getting a surcharge as a possibility, but I would like to argue that there'd be some kind of equity about that.
I would say no. The government has many, many ways to get our money. They don't need another.
I concur.
I support Councilmember Siemens and Schultz's positions.
So you don't want any support of this bill at all?
Right.
That we would not, you're turning down money.
Would we want to oppose it?
I'm for a no position.
Tell me which way it goes, Mayor, or what's the straw poll on this?
I just,
Any, how many, here we go. How many would support the bill? Raise a hand. How many would oppose the bill? Raise a hand. That's three.
That's
Four.
four. Okay.
So we're taking a position of oppose.
And
So just to make sure, we're opposing a bill that could potentially raise us revenue.
Potential.
People are comfortable with that.
We're opposing a bill to increase taxes on people's cars and other vehicles.
That we
But
may
we're
not see
also
it now.
opposing a bill that could raise money for a municipality.
Correct.
and
Okay.
might discourage people from having cars. Okay, so.
but
I-
if the bill gets, excuse me, but if the bill gets amended in some way that makes it more appealing, but as you've described it, it just sounds like we're never going to see anything out of this thing.
Well, but if we wanted to see something out of it, we would support with amendment and say you should change it so that we have a chance to get something. You can't
I'm not-
oppose and say, but change it.
Right.
You can say you oppose the bill in its current form.
But that's support with amendment. That's the way it works.
It's more strongly oppose.
We're opposed unless you amend it.
They,
period.
No,
they don't go for that.
No, because I'm opposed to, if it guarantees Tacoma Park gets the money, I'm still opposed to it.
I'd like to read this bill, and I would propose that we take this up again in a week or at the next session when we have a legislative update.
That's fine, and I can find out a little bit more with some of the.
I note that it has a sole sponsor in the Senate, Senator Madaleno, which is neither here nor there, except that there are many other bills that have multiple co-sponsors and all of that. I want to look at the bill myself.
And this may be a Mako bill.
Do you want me to bring it back then next week?
Yes.
Wait a minute, it does say authorizing a county or municipal corporation to impose. So
Right.
it
Yes.
authorizes us to do it regardless of, maybe I'm not understanding something.
I think
We can do it whether or not the county does it. It might not make us popular among the residents, but
We could do it if they don't.
we could do it even if they do.
I think
Well, the way-
further into the bill, there's language that,
I guess I need to read
Well,
this.
Let
I
me
mean, I'm
bring
just
it
not
back.
for sort of randomly adding a new city ability to tax residents without thinking about it strategically. If we wanted to think about taxes that we would like to impose or the ability to give rebates, and have a longer discussion, then I could see supporting it. But otherwise, it just sounds like we're supporting raising taxes on vehicles by $20 for
Could
residents.
we come back to this next session?
And just for information, I was for no position.
Right. Right, and there were 4 of us who were for opposing
Right,
it.
right. But it sounds like people want to back off and come back.
I'm concurring with Seth here. Let's just take another look at it after you've had a chance to figure it out.
so bring back next week. I just wanted to give a list of some of the bills that have been highlighted for us that have some economic development benefits. And in many of these, we will either monitor them, we will issue something of support, but we are going to check in with the various sponsors and see what would be most useful coming to us. A number of these are kind of incentive zones for either development, green development, energy efficient homes, rehabbing upper stories of commercial structures. So all of these things, we have looked at the bills. We think in general these are in our interest for our commercial areas or for some of our housing. And so I just wanted to kind of bring them to your attention that it's kind of nice to see this list. And, it's something that I think that we would not only want to support, but we would want to, if they're approved, share that information around with our various businesses. And there doesn't seem to be any need to take a position on these because they're similar to other ones that the council's taken in the past. I just wanted to bring them to your attention.
Unless there was one that was of particular interest that we wanted to do more
Or
of.
if you want to oppose them, yes, that would be something.
But somebody might want to testify on one.
Absolutely, and I would want to share that with you on ones that I thought were particularly important. None of these are particularly urgent. And we are following the opportunity to get more assistance for historic commercial properties. And that's within the budgets, and so we're following some of that. Finally, I just wanted to mention that Councilmember Smith will be testifying on Wednesday evening on the CIP urging the Flower Avenue $200,000 to be moved to fully funded in the full amount of $200,000 be in the FY16 CIP. The Public Works Director would like to also have us ask for, instead of 200, how about 400? So I think that would be a good idea. We certainly have plenty of need for increased funds, and many unincorporated Montgomery County residents will benefit from this project. So kind of reminding the council of that, I think is a good idea, the county council.
Any update on covered bus shelters? Will the county pay for them? Is there any loophole we can use?
I frankly think that this project can make a loophole.
Okay.
Mayor, did you have some legislative news?
I got the new list of like 16 bills late today. I haven't had a chance to look at them. I was going to forward them to folks if anybody has any input on any of the ones for this week's MML Legislative Committee meeting. That happens on Wednesday morning, so any input you have, I'll send that tonight.
I have a bill that I would like the City Council to support and bring before the MML as well.
Delegate Al Carr has now introduced his Municipal Street Lighting Investment Act. It would allow municipalities to buy their streetlights for the cost they estimate they're worth. He has 30 co-sponsors in the House of Delegates that include all 3 District 20 delegates. He has endorsements from the cities of Gaithersburg and Rockville. I think it would be entirely appropriate in our own interests for us to endorse that bill as well.
Yes, we were on record last year, and so I assumed that we would say yes. And so we'll transmit that information tomorrow with a statement.
Cool.
And what's the number on that one?
That is HB 729, and so far as I know, he does not have a Senate cross-filer yet, although he's working on it.
Okay.
729.
And that's probably one of the bills that's going to come up on Wednesday, I'm going to,
Yeah.
if not this week, next week.
And it's in Economic Matters for first reading. There's no date that I see, but it's supposed to be mid-February.
Right.
Oh, it had first reading, yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
that's normal.
Yeah, that's the submission, right.
That's it for me.
There's, I'm trying to remember, is it 662, 664, which is the MACO bill on changing the HUR distribution? They start monkeying with the figures.
Yes, there's some interesting HUR discussions, and I'm actually going to be talking to Michelle tomorrow to go through all that.
Because I tried to figure out exactly what they were doing with all those machinations of the changes, and I got lost.
Same here. Yeah, it's
If you figure anything out before Wednesday morning at 10 o'clock, if you can let me know what you think you figured out, we're going to be discussing it. And I was asked for my opinion, since I brought it to their attention, and they said, oh, yes, we're going to be doing that, and, oh, what do you think? So it basically, it looks at the HUR distribution formula in state law and starts monkeying with the percentage, what percentage in what year and who gets what, the breakdown between Baltimore City, the counties, and the municipalities. And some years it goes up and some years it goes down, and it looks, on the face of it, like the counties are trying to make a grab, but that's not entirely clear. So, and it's a Senator Madaleno bill. And it's on behalf of MACO.
And it's not entirely clear?
It's not entirely clear.
my assumption was that it was not good, so I
I
haven't done all the computations. Like I said,
Yeah,
we're
it's-
following it up, but I look very skeptically on something like that.
I do too, but on its face, it looks like, oh, they're trying to get us all our HUR money, but they're probably going, well, you got your special allocation of 16 million, and so now we have another route to get ours, so we'll take it all off the top. Anything else?
Nope.
Anybody got anything else? I think that takes care of it. We're adjourned.
Love it, love it, love it.